Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. The Fall of the Heavens. Groaning in pain, God Serena rubbed his shoulder where he had bruised himself in his fall. It was just his luck that Irene's magic had landed him on the side of a mountain. Falling down the side of it had hurt until he had managed to stop his fall, and it had involved his shoulders being slammed against the hard earth a few times too many. Still, he couldn't say that he would have preferred the alternative. He liked living, and taking Acknowledge's full attack would have hurt. He hadn't been completely lucky though. Half of one of the blasts had come with him, and he had barely avoided being caught in it. His right side had taken the brunt of the blow, and he was just glad he hadn't been closer when it had hit. Even looking back now, he could see the massive chunk missing from the mountain, covered by the landslide it caused when the earth above became unstable. Looking around, he could see he must have ended up in a ground zero type point. Quite a few of the blasts had ended up within his sight, and he could see the destruction they had caused quite clearly due to the sheer size of the impact points. Yes, he was really glad he hadn't been caught up in that attack. Even in death it appeared Irene was proving her worth. Huh. That's right, he realized. Irene was dead. Did he feel much? She had been a comrade for many years, but he wouldn't have ever said they were close. The closest thing he had to a friend was Jin, but he knew better than to call Jin a friend. Jin was the type to hold out a hand to help you while hiding a dagger behind his back with the other, and yet he had tended to spend most of his time with him if he had to choose between the others in their little group. Then there was the fact that he and Irene had never gotten along too well when Zeref was around. He would do what he wanted, choose his actions in the manners that gave him the most freedom. She meanwhile was too focused on the objective and how it would best benefit her precious emperor, taking actuals he hadn't even ordered if it meant getting him closer to his wishes. In the battles over Alvarez, it was no surprise that she was directly responsible for the fall of so many of their opponents, without Zeref having to order her to. A simple command to eliminate the Secure 1 area would have her coming back with 30 groups subjugated under the premise that they needed to be defeated in order to secure their hold on the region, with whole explanations on how the destruction of one group would push another into action and need to be countered. Honestly, he tended to ignore most of what she said, which had probably been why it had been so difficult to get along. In fact, he was pretty sure this mission was the first time they had ever managed to work together so well without complaint. Maybe it was because it was the very goal he had been aiming for, and that there were no other ways Irene could expand on it that had meant they had finally been in agreement with their methods for once. A shame, really. Now that she was dead, he'd probably find he would miss her annoying attitude. Glancing around, he did his best to try and work out where her magic had sent him. It was a shame she couldn't have had any control over this, but even if she had, he doubted it would have made that much of a difference. Any place she could have moved him to instead would still have not lasted after she died. He hoped he wasn't too far though. If he just looked and tried to keep his senses open for anything. He could Zeref now. Or at least who he assumed had to be him, going by the fact he could sense Acknowledge's magic twice now. It could have been that saber-tooth mage admittedly, but his magic still had its own signature to it. It wasn't identical like the one he was picking up frequently from where he assumed Acknowledge was. Well, he should probably hurry over. The others wouldn't last long without him, and he wouldn't last long without them if he ended up all alone. Preparing to kick off the ground and take back to the air, he froze as he noticed the first signs of it. No. You fool. You goddamn fool. He doubted anyone else had noticed yet. He doubted anyone else even would have recognized the signs. But he had been a wizard saint once, and had walked through the halls of the Magic Council. He'd seen their secrets, told a fair few of them to Zeref when he joined, and so he would recognize this sight anywhere due to the images he had been shown. The circling of clouds and the slow gathering of magic in the atmosphere, a direct result of the immeasurable amount held up much higher in the sky, far beyond the reach of even the dragons. The magic said to be held within the heavens themselves. Juoshiro, what have you done? He muttered in horror. He typically loved spotlights on him, but this was far too bright for him. Glancing back down towards the battle in the distance. He'd get there in time easily enough. But could he get out too? Zeref. He could do it. As many of them as he could, he'd drag them over to the dark mage and hide within the man's shadow. It was the only hope of surviving this. Hurrying, he pushed himself as fast as he could go as he rushed towards the battle in the distance, one eye being used to keep an eye on the clouds above as they began to take on the familiar shape more and more with each passing second, the sky slowly beginning to darken and the winds beginning to change. Make it, he muttered desperately, knowing things would only get worse if he didn't. I have to make it. He had to hurry. Before Etherian fired and wiped this whole place and everyone on it off the map except the one being it wouldn't crush. Protector of the Fairies. Catching the fist of Acknowledge with one hand, Zeref couldn't stop smirking as he threw a wave of Acknowledge's own magic straight back at the dragon. This strength was incredible. As much as he hated to admit it, utilizing that abomination's power had been an interesting experience. There had been so much concentrated power that he could have easily felt intoxicated by the feeling. But this took it far beyond that. He had known Acknowledge was powerful, he always had, but he was now coming to understand that he had never truly seen the depths of the dragon's power. Just with the massive amount of energy he had taken in, he could feel like he could accomplish anything. With a wave of his hand, even the strongest enemies would fall through sheer strength. With even the slightest bit of concentrated effort, all things could crumble before him. Was this how Acknowledge felt? Did he feel this sensation every second? How had he had the willpower to not destroy the world with such strength? His desire to slay dragons was truly beyond comprehension. If he had been able to suppress any temptation this power would have brought merely to allow him the chance to slay the few remaining. However, this energy wasn't without its downsides. As he prepared to swing out, to follow up his previous attack with another equally powerful one, he felt his arm shake, resisting his movements as it struggled with an unseen force. By the time he managed to get it back under control, he was being thrown across the air, the phantom pain from having his guts torn out still lingering on his chest. Acknowledger really wasn't holding his punches, it appeared. Had the dragon realized his inability to actively utilize his normal magic in this state? Or was he that confident that he could dodge his death field? He wouldn't be surprised with the latter. If the abomination could do it, so could Acknowledge. Preparing to attack again, he felt his body lock up momentarily before he managed to force his way past, bringing his hands together and launching a wave of pure Dragon Slayer energy straight at the dragon. This was the major downside to this power, more so than it locking off his normal magic. Absorbing the energy was easy. Keeping it in, that was the problem. The magic recognized it wasn't his own, and it tried to resist the spell he had cast and break free. If he had been anyone else, he would have had his body ripped apart. Only his immortality allowed his body to withstand the pressure from within, repairing far faster than the magic could damage it. But even with all that, it still resisted him. It had never been this bad, admittedly. Not even the abomination's energy had caused this to happen. Every time he exerted a bit too much of Acknowledge's power, he felt the backlash hit him. It was easy enough to quell, but not before he had lost his chance to push his luck. An immortal body was only helpful if he could use it to continue to push the advantage, as he would only get so many chances. Already he could feel a noticeable difference. How much of Acknowledge's magic had he already used? How much did he have left? As much as he would like to end the fight, he knew he wouldn't be able to. One-on-one, Acknowledge was still too powerful. He was hitting the dragon back with his own power and it was merely slowing the dragon down. But if he could draw the dragon's focus for long enough, perhaps this act would have some kind of meaning in this fight. What's wrong, Acknowledge? He taunted, letting loose an arc of energy with a wave of his hand, filling a large area of the sky before it was batted out of the way by a swing of Acknowledge's hand. Are you having trouble dealing with me? You are beginning to annoy me, Zeref. Beginning to? I would have thought END had started that already. His words only got him a massive blast of magic to the face, the feeling of the top half of his body being destroyed lingering in his mind as he felt the odd sense of disconnection it brought. And then he was back, lashing out with a blast of his own and forcing Acknowledge to count it with a hastily constructed attack of his own. Putting a bit more energy into the attack, he pushed his luck that bit further and was rewarded when it managed to overpower Acknowledge's own. Immediately he was closing the gap, gathering as much of Acknowledge's magical power up as quickly as he could and swinging it down at the dragon. At the last moment, however, his arm locked up and the energy was expelled forth too early, skimming across Acknowledge's shoulder as it passed rather than its intended target. With what he assumed was done out of cruelty, Acknowledge struck out at him not once, not twice, but at least 15 times before he managed to pull his body back from the onslaught. Phantom pains from lacerations littered his body, the feeling of his neck being cut open still lingering, but it was easy enough to push such pain to the side and ignore it after centuries of practice. He was already moving to counter-attack when, out of the way, he would have recognized that voice anywhere, whether it be in the deepest darkness or in the loudest crowd. His smirk vanished entirely, resembling something far more natural as he easily let himself fall downwards rather than press forward. No sooner had he done so had his brother flown right over his head and slammed a fist straight into Acknowledge's face. The dragon hadn't expected his brother's sudden arrival. It didn't take long for Acknowledge to try and return the favor, however. He had hardly moved from the blow, and he quickly lashed out with the same viciousness that he had only aimed so far at him. His brother tried to dodge, kicking back and using his flames to push himself away, but it didn't stop Acknowledge's claws from reaching him and leaving deep scars along his chest. That wound, however, was not going to stop his brother. The wound was already beginning to heal, which meant the girl below was still working hard it seemed, and he could tell by the scowl that appeared on Acknowledge's face that he wasn't happy with that particular piece of information. Magic was being drawn quickly to the dragon's aid, summoned forth ready for an attack bound to be meant to eliminate his brother in one blow. Shame he didn't plan for that to happen. By the time Natsu had begun to fall back to dodge Acknowledge's strike, he had already been on the move. Acknowledge was so focused on END for that moment that he didn't even see him coming until he dove out from behind his brother, his hand already engulfed in magic as he slammed it straight into Acknowledge's chest and sent him flying back through the air. He didn't even need to say anything when he and Natsu took off after Acknowledge. With his power enhanced by Acknowledge's, he was easily keeping pace with Natsu's own speed, something he was amazed by how happy that made him as they both reached Acknowledge together and struck out in sync. Energy from Acknowledge met their strike, but it was completely different this time. The energy was quickly burnt away by Natsu's flames, and if on instinct a hole opened up in the flames for his attack to slam straight through, straight into a defenseless Acknowledge. His smile grew more as he pushed ahead, his brother circling round with an equally wide smirk and charging in from the side. Acknowledge blocked both their strikes this time, catching their fists with one hand each and bringing them to a halt. Or at least he managed to until he threw himself forward, abandoning any form of fighting and instead latching onto Acknowledge with all his strength, directly a single look towards his brother. Immediately the flames barely being held back by Acknowledge swelled in size, firing forward and consuming them both. It hurt incredibly, and for a moment he could remember the time he had once thought this curse might be able to kill him. Even now as the flames continued to burn, he could feel his immortality slowing, beginning to falter as the very magic that fueled it was burnt away. Flames had long since grown to be painless for him to deal with, but these ones had always seemed to be a rare exception. They had provided him a rare glimpse at mortality. His grip was torn away as he felt his arms melt away, Acknowledge breaking free and darting back, his scales being discarded as he shot down towards the ground. Natsu quickly zoomed down after him and he followed, though not of his own accord. He couldn't even find the strength to try and stop his fall, or at least he couldn't until the flames were pulled away by his brother. The second they died out, all his strength returned as the magic around him pulled him back to life. For all the flames' power, it was a shame they couldn't reach beyond the surface. They could only burn what they could reach, and the magic that kept him alive, even when his body failed, was not so easily reached. By the time they were about to hit the ground, they were both ready. Natsu pulled himself to a stop as he curved through the air and rushed straight to Acknowledge. His arrival wasn't so gracefully, landing on the other side of Acknowledge with a loud thud. His bones shattered briefly, slowing him down, before he was pushing himself out of the hole and leaping forward with Acknowledge's power to propel him. Acting quickly, he saw Acknowledge spin round and send a wave of magic straight at his brother, exploding against him and taking away an arm in the blast. That however meant that Acknowledge had been forced to turn away from him, and by the time Acknowledge tried to correct his mistake his fist had already connected with the dragon, unleashing the payload of magic held within. The explosion of magic sent Acknowledge flying backwards, and the dragon quickly managed to recover to retaliate. He was even charging forward, an attack building up, to give the illusion that he was pressing the advantage. Well, he couldn't say he wasn't. But it wasn't him who would get the next strike. Even with one arm, the other yet to be restored, his brother was far too strong to let that stop him. And his last attack had thrown Acknowledge straight at him. He'd be foolish to not take this opportunity. Acknowledge worked it out too late, and he could see the moment when the dragon realized his mistake. He doubted he'd ever forget the look of shock appear on the dragon's face, the widening of his eyes before the beginning of a turn taking place. It never finished, not when Natsu swung his fist from behind and fired a massive blast of flames straight into the dragon. The roar of pain was immensely satisfying, and as Acknowledge stumbled back, burnt skin over the right side of his face, he couldn't help but smile wider. Blow after blow, he and Natsu rained down on Acknowledge. When he tried to run, they chased him down. Acknowledge was far stronger than the two of them combined, but there was little he could do when they continued to charge straight at him in such reckless fashions. And for every move one of them made, the other was reacting and attacking in sync or taking advantage of the openings it would cause. Was there anyone who could fight with him like this? Was there anyone that he could sink himself to without losing himself to his childish instincts? No, there wasn't. Because this was something only they could do. He understood everything there was about his brother. He had needed to in order to bring him back, and he could determine every move his brother would make without even needing to look. And that made it easy for his brother to work with him too. In the game he saw this as. To his brother, he was being shown hints or tricks to beat this opponent. And even if he didn't understand it, his brother was able to understand these things on an instinct level because of their connection. His own will was carried in his magic and fed to the book of END, and even if he wasn't aware of it, the very nature of their connection was ensuring his brother understood it. Fighting like this, working together in such a way, this was everything he wished it could have been years ago. He and Natsu, always by each other's side. Protecting each other, having the other's back, moving in sync without even a single word being exchanged. His smile grew nostalgic as he felt himself slipping into memories of those early years, merely imagining the what-ifs as he brought his fist back. And then he faltered. It wasn't for a second this time, nor for a few. He simply faltered, his feet slipping on the air as the magic holding up disappeared. At some point, without him hardly realizing, they had taken back to the skies, and he was still frozen as he tried to work out what had happened until he hit the ground. Zeref. He could hear his brother crying out to him, only for his brother to suddenly join him down here, Acknowledge throwing him down furiously and causing his brother to hit the ground with a cry. He didn't see much movement, which meant the damage must have been more serious than it looked. How long would it take his brother to get back up again? He'd have to take the defensive over him until then. He was already forcing his body to move, reaching for the magic he needed when he came to a single cold conclusion of what had just occurred. You ran out, Acknowledge said cruelly from above, forcing him to look up at the form of the unstoppable dragon. Taking in the dragon's appearance for the first time in a while, he noticed the lack of visible injuries that should have littered the dragon's body. Only the burn remained on the right side of his face, the eye damaged and unfocused, leaving only Acknowledge's left to glare down at them. Was that all they had done though? After all those strikes, after all those blows, had they not managed to do anything more than that? Had Acknowledge, had the dragon been leading them around this entire fight? He had been so lost in that fight that it was only now he was realizing that Acknowledge had become too reactive in their clashes. You took those hits on purpose, Zeref muttered. Drew us in and tried to minimize the damage. All because you were waiting. Did you enjoy your little power trip? Acknowledge called down, slowly lowering himself in the air to draw nearer to them. Did you like using my magic? I hope it was fun while it lasted. Because now that it's gone, you have nothing left. He had been careless, and Acknowledge's words only hammered that point home. If he hadn't gotten so lost in the joy he had experienced by Natsu's side, he would have realized that in his haste to match his brother in battle he had been expending the magic he had stolen at a far faster race. He couldn't even feel a single fragment of Acknowledge's magic left in his system, and without it he couldn't harm the dragon before him. You were both pains to deal with, Acknowledge said viciously. If there is one thing I hate about beings with immortalities like yours, it's those with power. A bug is still a bug, even if it can't be crushed. But a dragon that can't die is so much worse if it can still kill you. You should have tried harder, because you missed your one chance to kill me, Ziref. You won't get another. Now, how should I finish this? Aknologia asked, turning his head to glance at the movement coming from END. Should I destroy this entire area? This should slow you down enough that you can't do anything to stop me reaching that girl with your book. A cruel smirk crossed Aknologia's face as he suddenly swiped out to the side, his magic being fired in an arc and slicing through the air towards a figure in the distance. Or maybe I'll deal with the pest trying to help the other dragons back up. He didn't need any explanations to know who the dragon had just fired that attack had. The answer was all but given by the time a faint scream was heard as the attack hit in the distance. Protector of the Fairies. Gritting her teeth, it did little to help Wendy as the pain flooded her entire nerves. It wasn't like with Natsu's flames from earlier, but it still hurt so much. She tried to push herself up from the ground with one hand, and that only served to cause her to try and not to scream again from pain. As he drew her hand back, she found it quickly coming back sticky, covering in the red blood that was pouring out from her severed leg. She had almost reacted in time. She had seen the battle in the distance and had thought she had been safe to move a bit faster, hoping to reach the others as quickly as possible. Their injuries had looked so severe even from such a great distance, and leaving them any longer than necessary had been something she had really not wanted to do. By the time Nabera had shouted out to her in warning, she had been too late. It had been sheer luck that the attack had only severed her left leg at her knee. It had almost gotten her at the waist, and behind her she could still see the large gorge the magic had made as it continued to slice through into the earth. Could she use Nirvana again to heal her injuries? It really hurt, and if she didn't stop the bleeding soon, then she wouldn't even reach her friends at this crawl of a pace. Though if she did do it, that was just going to leave her with less magic to work with overall. Looking up too, she was close but still had a bit to go to reach her friends. With how much magic Nirvana needed for healing herself, would she still be fine to heal them afterwards? Would she even have time? Nabera. Distance doesn't matter with Nirvana, right? Don't do it. If distance doesn't matter, can I do the same to heal them as you've done for me? I said don't do it. That's not a no, she chuckled dryly, already reaching for the magic of Nirvana when she felt a brick wall hit her path towards it. Nabera. You first. I'll do it afterwards. No, Nabera stated harshly. Because the very reason you're saying this now, is because you believe you won't have enough magic or time to heal them afterwards. I won't have you throw your life away, and you can't just recklessly try and use Nirvana to recover lost magic either. There is always a limit, and I'm afraid you could get very close to it if you keep this up. If they don't get back up, it'll have little left in it anyway to do much. Why not take the risk? Don't think like that, Wendy, Nabera shot back. You need to still have hope. Despite all odds, none of you are dead yet. You can still make it through this day. Then what's wrong with me making sure of that? She tried to push back against Nabera, but his grip on Nirvana was too strong, resisting her with every move she made. For every inch she managed to gain, he retook 5. Nabera, please dash. Are you talking to someone? She froze, struggling to turn over when a foot suddenly slammed into her and did it for her. She was barely managing to regain her breath from the blow when the same foot slammed down on her chest, pinning her to the ground. That's a strange lacrima, Aknologia stated, looking down at her coldly. Is that the source of the strange magic you have been using? He glanced back up to her eyes coldly before adding, well, if it's not dragon magic then I guess it's no threat any further. Once you die, it'll be useless. Air. She needed air. In response to her desperate desire, however, Aknologia pressed down further with his foot, making it even harder to breathe and terrifying her with every passing second. Where was Natsu or Ziref? Had something happened? Was that why Aknologia had sent an attack towards her? What about Levi? Was she fine? It's a pain that you got so close. If I hadn't noticed, you might have made it. I was just about ready to go and try and finish END off for good this time. But I can't have you helping those dragons back on their feet. Not willingly, of course. and you have been a pain for quite some time today. How fitting that the next to fall is the one that was holding them all together. Let her go. She recognized that voice, straining her head to see Toshiro leaning against a wall of ice, his sword held loosely in his left hand. Against the ice wall though, all she could see was a replica of his right made out of ice. Oh? I figured you get up again, but you took some time. He was helping some of us out, said Sting, standing unsteadily as he tried to keep his balance, one hand clutching the side of a bloody face. You don't hold back, he muttered, spitting out some blood. He really doesn't, came Gajiel's voice too, the sound of iron being scrapped across the ground following his voice as the split halves of his dragon forced themselves along the ground, half repaired through beams of iron in between each other. He was still clutching his chest as he stood in the center of the dragon's mouth, dried blood around his stomach where metal coated his entire wound. Even with the metal, however, he was leaning heavily against one side of the dragon's mouth, and the fact it was having to pull itself across the ground was telling of his condition. Still hurts like a bitch. They all looked terrible. But even so, they were still getting back up. Still ready to fight. She wanted to smile at such a sight, but she couldn't. Not when there was still one missing. She could still see his form in the distance. That wasn't a clone or a decoy. That was Laxus. Even if the others had been able to drag themselves back up, the same couldn't be said for the oldest of them. If their injuries had been painful, his had been far worse from the look of it. And yet as she looked up towards Acknowledge, expecting to see annoyance or even preparing for more cruel words, she found herself freezing at the sight. Was he smiling? It looked like he was. Not a cruel smirk or a vicious one, nor even a smile from the pain he was causing. It looked natural. Like he was truly happy, just because they were still up. All right then, she heard him say. She wasn't even sure if she was meant to have heard that, or if she only did because she was so close. It was like he had even forgotten her for a moment, the pressure on her chest letting up. Let's go for a bit longer. Then suddenly that odd expression on his face was gone, and he was looking down at her cruelly like before. Before we begin though, why don't I just get rid of the little one first? The others were already trying to move, but as Acknowledger raised his hand she knew they'd be too slow. She wouldn't even be able to reach for Nirvana's magic in time. She'd avoided death multiple times before, but was this? What's that? She hardly registered the fact that she had uttered those words out loud, her eyes looking far past Acknowledge and up into the sky above. She didn't even notice when Acknowledge halted his strike, his head turning up to follow her gaze. She doubted he ever would have done so if she hadn't been showing such a confused look, so unfocused on him and instead the sight above her. It wasn't a look that could be easily faked. The clouds are circling, Acknowledge muttered warily, recognizing the odd weather pattern for something ominous. If only he could have seen what she could have seen. Magic was swirling up there, focused around a single point and expanding out like a storm in all directions. She'd never seen anything like this before, or at least not in such massive quantities. The only thing that came close was Etherian, Acknowledge muttered out for her, and she found herself agreeing with him at the sight. The closest thing she had seen to this was from the miniature Etherian blasts that came from the Genesis. But this was on a far greater scale. This was the real thing, not a miniature version but the full-scale weapon of mass destruction. Slowly, however, her focus was drawn away as Acknowledge lifted his leg from her chest. Is that how the humans want to play it? They want to end everything like that. A cold, emotionless laugh escaped his throat as he continued to stare up at the sight of it. In the end, this is my fate, isn't it? To even have the end of my goal ruined. This time period. I had forgotten how much I hated it looking back. His wings spread out before he slowly started to rise, heading up towards the sky and looking back down at them. A shame. It appears this is how you will all meet your end. I will not be joining you, however. An attack like this is dangerous, however that is only if it even manages to gain a direct hit. With those words said he was off like a rocket, trying to put some distance between himself and the blast zone. She had a feeling she knew what he was doing. Merely looking at what she could see, Etherian was mere moments away from firing. Energy was already beginning to become visible through the gaps in the clouds, and once that time passed all that magic would fall down upon them. It would hit everything at its path and destroy the ground entirely upon impact. He'd never escape in time. The blast zone would be too wide going by this amount of energy. But he didn't need to escape. If he was this confident, he would probably still survive anything but a direct hit. If he wasn't caught in the epic entree, he'd live. Glancing at the others, she could see the hope vanishing in their eyes once more. After struggling back, and forcing themselves to keep going, they had still managed to believe they could win in their state. They had still held out hope of victory. That light couldn't go out now. It wouldn't reignite if it did. So just like how they had stopped hers from going out, she would do the same for them. Nabara. I need a favor. This one, Wendy, I will help you with. Good. Magic flooded into her as Nabara stopped blocking her from Nirvana, and she could feel herself getting pulled into that world that only he could see. She didn't hesitate to throw herself into it, not even caring about whether she could find her way back afterwards. The deeper she fell, the more of the world she understood. The patterns of movement in the air, the direction of every bit of magic as it darted and followed lines now made fully visible to her. She could see everything, understand everything, and she knew what to do. Don't worry, she said, not daring to glance at her friends who looked so odd to her eyes right now. If she looked at them for too long, she was sure she would begin to view them as something to study, something to analyze and understand before manipulating to her heart's content. So instead she focused on the sight above her. Etherian was firing, or had already fired perhaps, and the flow of energy was already clear to her. It was massive. It extended further than even her eyes could see. But she understood what she had to do clearly. No matter how far it stretched, the distance wouldn't be an obstacle. The magic she needed came to her hand easily, and as she raised it she let it flow across the air above her, high enough to ensure that Levi would still be safe below it. She was running low on magic though. Would she have enough? Yes. She would. It didn't matter if she was running low. There was plenty around her. As if listening to her silent request, Nabara answered it. She could feel him taking control of part of Nirvana, siphoning off some of her limited magic and fueling it into a constant spell around her. It was incredible to see to her eyes. Every bit of magic around her was being redirected, drawn towards her, and then disappeared. And with every drop that vanished from the air around her, she felt her strength growing as her magic replenished once more. But something else came with it too. It was hard to notice at first, easy to miss, but she could feel it growing with every moment. A slight burning sensation, running through her body like a fire had been lit beneath her skin. And with it came an unusual type of pain, unlike one she had felt before. Even as it began to grow, however, it wasn't noticeable enough to distract her from her task. She was too busy trying to spread her spell over the world, covering every inch of the nearby sky and ensuring she hadn't missed a spot. Her leg was going to be an issue for what she wanted to do though. Did she have time to heal it? No, she and Nabara were already going to be pressed thin to do this. So instead the familiar sensation of dragon force came back to her, the weight pressing down from the sky vanishing as her body began to rise of its own accord, the air helping her to rotate so that she would be able to raise her hand up to the sky above her head. With the last of the magic in what she hoped was everywhere, she noticed Etherian in all its glory. The clouds themselves were consumed as it rained down, looking as if the heavens themselves were caving in on them. She could understand why it had generated so much fear to anyone who knew what it was. Faced with this, anyone would lose hope. An attack could be weathered only so long as you could compete against the opposing force of magic, but she wasn't sure there was a creature alive capable of withstanding this weapon. Her eyes didn't linger on it for long, any fear she might have had being bled away by the knowledge that guided her hand. It was fine to be a bit scared, because even Acknowledge was. And it was that same thought that could make her still move. Because if he was wary enough to leave, it meant he actually viewed it as a threat to himself. He saw it as something capable of killing him, and for that she wouldn't let him escape. As the energy from above slammed down, holding enough firepower to wipe out the entire area and all life in it, she made her move. Her hand moved, softly at first as it traced across the air above her head. She could feel the sensation of Nirvana's magic in her fingertips, the platform for the entire magic to be transmitted across with her simple direction. And then, right before the energy made contact, she pushed her hand up through the magic towards the fleeing dragon. She could feel the sheer power of Etherian rub across her skin, scraping some of it away as her hand barely came down in time. But the pain didn't bother her at all in light of the sky she could see. The moment her hand had been pushed through her energy, the same motion had been applied everywhere along her magic. She had watched as the lines that had guided the spell from downwards had twisted at their ends and changed direction, following up after her movement. The result was the sight before her, one in which the entirety of Etherian's massive fire power was redirected back up towards the sky and the dragon she had seen fleeing through it before Etherian had blocked even her sight. A magic to switch darkness and light, she muttered as she turned her head, glancing at her friends and watching the odd sight they represented to her as the light began to return to their eyes at the sight of hope. I think that's an appropriate description of this power, Nabera. It always was, Wendy. It always was. Protector of the fairies. In this land there still breathe dragons. Everything seemed to hurt. Breathing was an almost impossible task, and yet he had somehow managed to claw his way back to consciousness, with only a vague recollection of what was even happening around him. The sky was odd. All the clouds had disappeared by the time he had managed to see the sky again, and instead the blue he had expected to see was replaced by pure white light. And then there was the feeling from it, like an unstoppable force was bearing down on him from above. Was it like this for everyone else? He had already tried to move his head, but he couldn't even find the strength to do that. Even his right arm wasn't responding properly, the lightning that connected the two not working properly for some reason. Was it because he was so drained that he couldn't control it properly? He hadn't ever felt like this before, but then no one had ever taken him this close to death before since he got this arm. Not even his future self. You don't look good. That voice. He recognized it, but he couldn't place it. Remembering was hard, but he could see the color pink float forward, a large contrast to the white sky above. He tried to speak, to ask them their name or even say something sarcastic and put on a brave face, but all of that took more energy than he really had to give. A decent amount of magic left, surprisingly. Guess you're further along than I initially thought. And with those wounds, a normal human wouldn't have been able to cling to life for this long like you have. Further along? A normal human? Ah yes, that would explain it, he supposed. He was becoming less human with every passing moment, so perhaps his changing physiology had helped buy him some time. Don't worry. You'll be fine. This is a tough one. You're unusual, even to these eyes. But I see how to put you back together again. Shame I can't reverse this back. I can only bring you back to the state your body should be in now. Bear with me a moment. Odd magic washed over him, and with it his pain began to disappear. Suddenly it was easier to focus, easier to move, easier to even breathe. He was up like a shot, his head snapping round towards the source of his savior in pure shock. Wendy! He muttered, realizing quickly that he should have recognized her sooner. Only looking at her, something was different. Odd. Wrong. She had always been a brave girl, trying to face danger even when scared. But she had also been odd at times, seeing things almost none of them could. Seeing the very magic of the world as it floated through the air, following unseen paths that were all too visible to her keen eyes. Many of them had grown used to how she could start staring at nothing, realizing it merely meant she had noticed something they couldn't see. But the way she looked now, the odd light that appeared to dance in her eyes, she hardly looked the same to him. Rather than the girl, he saw a thing. Something that was looking at him, looking right through him, with eyes that seemed to peer deep into his very soul. The magic connected to her hands further altered the image he had of her. It had to have been Nirvana, it was the only other magic she had access to after her Sky Dragon Slayer magic, but he doubted she had ever wielded it in this way before. The light that was coming off her hands, or rather being manipulated like strings wrapped around her fingers, would brush against him as she continued to stare, and he could feel his wounds healing as the magic brushed against him. Except they weren't healing, he was noticing. He may not have been capable of it, but he had at least the rudimental knowledge to know how healing magic worked. It was a great gift for those that could use it. With it, they could restore patients back to full health, or as close as they could, through various ways. From regeneration of limbs in extreme cases to the simple methods of reducing fevers, they could all perform life-saving feats. But despite all that, they did at least share one common threat even when they differed. They always healed, whether that be by reducing symptoms or encouraging the body to produce the necessary ingredients to fix itself. And regeneration did that, if at an incredibly fast and forced rate. But his severed left arm, that wasn't being regrown. Nor were his legs. He could see the flesh getting pulled back towards him. He could see the blood that had even started to dry on the ground being sucked back up and pulled towards his body. Every part of his body that Acknowledge had torn off, it was being brought right back and forced into the exact place it should have been. This wasn't healing. He knew it wasn't. It was something far more powerful, but also far more worrying. Just from looking into those eyes, still staring back at him in such an inhuman manner, he could tell Wendy was observing and seeing every part of him being placed back into its proper slot, like a jigsaw piece she was assembling. And the fact she could see him like that, when she had never even looked at any of them in such a way before, frightened him. "I'm sorry." He froze, noticing the frown that seemed to cross Wendy's face. It looked odd on her when her eyes still continued to see straight through him. "What about? I'm scaring you, aren't I? I'm sorry. I didn't want to look at any of you, but you were hurt, so I..." Even as she said those words, even as her voice broke slightly, her eyes didn't change their look. What did they look like to her, he wondered. And suddenly he found his fears disappearing, even when facing with the alien look she had. Why had he even been so frightened? Pathetic. Just listening to her voice, he could tell she was probably more scared than any of them. For someone as kind and caring as her to have to look at them in a way so alien to them, so alien to her, what she was seeing was probably something she wished she could. But she was doing it anyway so that she could save his life. What kind of guild master was he if he had to have one of those he was meant to protect do something so scary just to save him? Gramps would probably be rolling over in his grave, demanding the title be passed back to him for another few years so he could show him how it was really done. He even found himself chuckling at the thought before he forced himself to meet Wendy's eyes once more and put on a gentle smile, one he had seen so many times on his grandfather's face. "It's all right, Wendy. You don't need to be worried." Wendy nodded, her eyes lingering on him for a few moments longer before she tore them away as fast as she could. He could feel the effects of nirvana fading as she lowered her hand, he light dimming slightly but not enough that she had stopped using it. It was like she was keeping it ready for something. Or someone. Memories flooded back to him as he got to his feet, his right arm returning to him as his control over his lightning restored itself. "Acknowledge. Where is he?" Wendy slowly raised a hand, pointing a finger towards a point in the sky. He was only starting to realize now that what he had thought was a changed color was in fact pure energy, slowly being dispersed back into the atmosphere. The densest pocket left was right where Wendy was drawing his eyes to, however. "Acknowledge is up there? What happened?" "Etherian was fired," Wendy muttered. "It was going to kill everyone, but Acknowledge would have escaped from it. So I turned its path away from us and had it collide with Acknowledge instead." She said that so calmly. Did she even realize what she was saying? She had redirected Etherian, the most powerful weapon in the entire world, and fired it straight back into Acknowledge. A feat like that. It was unheard of. Overpowering Etherian hadn't ever been done, and he doubted even the strongest powerhouses like Ichigo could perform such a feat if Acknowledge had thought it best to flee. And here was Wendy, one of the most compassionate people he knew, with far less magical power than any other dragon slayer present, who had done the impossible. She hadn't overpowered Etherian, but redirecting it was the same as rendering the attack powerless against her in his books. He wasn't going to ask how she did it. It was probably nirvana, and probably the entire reason she was looking at him so oddly earlier. He'd just settle for the result and be thankful she had done what she had done. "Where's everyone else?" "Checking on the others." "Follow me. We aren't going to change on Acknowledge. Make sure he's not still alive." Wendy paused for a moment, her eyes lingering on the dense pocket of energy. "I can't see through it." Etherian holds too much energy and it's blocking my sight from seeing what happened. He couldn't survived it, but we can't risk charging in there in case he did. Etherian could still be deadly in such large amounts too. We should regroup. Raising her hand, she stretched it out to the side before pausing again, as if unsure of her actions. Would it be rude if I just brought everyone here? You can do that. Yes. It would be so easy. Maybe I should leave Ziref behind though. He might take my actions badly and he's here. What? Laxus spun his head round to find Ziref appearing from his shadow, an annoyed look across his face as he rubbed the side of his neck. He almost threw a punch on instinct, only holding back by remembering they were allies right now. I guess you were right. He disappeared, and his path lead here. And I'll thank you for not redirecting my magic, Ziref stated, looking at her with interest. Out of curiosity, who am I speaking to right now? Is this Wendy Marvel or is this the existence of Nirvana speaking? I don't follow. No, I suspect you don't, muttered Ziref, his gaze not wavering until Laxus stepped in front of him to block his sight. Sighing at the obviously threatening action, Ziref took a step back as a sign of good faith before gesturing his bead back up towards the sky. Nice work anyway. A sight like that makes me glad the Nervits had been so focused on trying to save everyone through bringing them to the light. You might very well surpass Nirvana's creator given a few years if you are already capable of this much. You look odd, Wendy said in turn, as if she hadn't even been listening to his words. So that's why you can't die. Laxus noticed Ziref stiffen in an instant, his curious look turning into the cold look of the man who had slaughtered thousands upon thousands without any hesitation. You see quite far if you can already grasp concepts. Not odd actual, Wendy muttered, still not seeming to hear Ziref. Wrong. But also, right. She frowned, blinking a few times as if it would make her vision clearer and make more sense. I knew magic loved you but I didn't realize just how much it did. This isn't pure love. This is obsession. A complete refusal to ever let you split from its grasp. Wendy, Laxus snapped out, bringing a hand in front of her eyes and blocking her sight. He noticed her lean back in shock, confusion in her voice briefly as she called out to him questioningly. Laxus? What's dash? Let's not aggravate our ally more than necessary, all right? Aggravate? Ah. It seemed she realized now what she was doing, and he couldn't deny that the fact she had been so lost worried him a bit. I'm sorry. I'll get the others now. Light burst out from her hand before he could say anything and instantly they were joined by the others, pieces of earth vanishing as their friends returned to them. Huh. Taoshiro looked around in confusion, and he could see that the others had the same bewildered look on too. Well, except for END, but then the demon had already spotted Ziref and had bound over towards him. Ziref. Did you see that? The light went whoosh, and then zoom. Yes Natsu, I saw it, Ziref chuckled, actual raising a hand and patting Natsu on the head. He hated the sight, seeing Natsu being treated like that and seeing how Natsu seemed to brighten up further under the attention. Still, he wasn't going to say anything. He didn't want to be E.N.D's next toy to play with. Laxus, you alright, Taoshiro muttered in relief as he rushed towards him, examining him all over. Taoshiro wasn't the only one either, Gajeel and Sting getting awfully close to him as they tried to check in case he was pretending to be fine and would fall over any minute. That was Wendy's magic right? Gajeel asked before patting his stomach. Seems she did a pretty good job on you. She rushed right over to you after healing our injuries in almost no time at all. It's no surprise she could bring him back to full health, Taoshiro pointed out, holding up his right hand. She reattached one of my limbs so it would have been unlikely for her to have any problems with Laxus. So that was the girl huh? Spoke God Serena, looking around a bit at the area he had been transported to before giving Wendy a nod. Good work. I thought it was all over when I saw Etherian begin to fire. We should hurry and finish Acknowledge off before he has a chance to recover. Recover? Sting shot a look at God Serena in pure disbelief, one Laxus felt entitled to share considering the situation. Etherian hit him. Let me repeat that. Etherian hit him. You think there's still going to even be a body after all of that? Knowing Acknowledge. God Serena turned towards Zeref. What do you think? Based on what we have seen far, it's entirely possible. Most certainly, Zeref confirmed. Acknowledge is an unstoppable beast. Since Etherean doesn't have any Dragon Slayer magic to it, all that force would be hitting his scales and not penetrating through any layers of it like all of your magic does. But with the sheer amount of magical power thrown at him, I wouldn't be surprised if he had lost at least an arm or a leg or dash. An earth-shattering roar overpowered all of Zeref's words, deafening all those that heard it briefly as they desperately tried to cover their ears to block out the sound. All eyes were immediately drawn to the source, the same spot in the sky where the energy had once been the thickest. Only now, something had changed about it. All that energy was being moved, expanding out before being drawn straight back in, as if collapsing into a center point. "Hold on," muttered Sting, the disbelief in his voice slowly making way for pure terror with each word. That's not. It's entirely possible," muttered Zeref gravely. Etherean is a weapon of pure energy, made up of multiple elements that slowly bring it back to pure magic itself. It's an incredible feat of magic, even harnessing the power of unison raids to strengthen it far beyond its original limits. And what is Acknowledge but a hybrid, a dragon whose very energy is magic itself? Except that sheer amount. God Serena couldn't stop staring at the sight, as more of the remaining energy was drawn forth towards the center where Acknowledge was undoubtedly waiting. I can do the same, but not to this extent. I tend to eat the magic in the air, or in some cases I siphon off some of the magic from a powerful attack. But there's always a limit. God Serena's right, Zeref agreed. Don't be fooled by this show. You should all have familiar experiences of trying to eat too much at once. With the sheer amount of magic that hit Acknowledge, he would never have been able to devour all of it. All he's doing is devouring the leftovers, and that will only restore his magical power. The damage he took. Zeref's words slowly trailed off as the last of the energy cleared, revealing Acknowledge to them once more. And it became pretty apparent to all of them why he had fallen silent. Because above them right now, Acknowledge didn't have a single wound on him. That's not right, Wendy muttered. That's impossible, Laxus threw in himself, looking at the impossible sight in disbelief. There's no way, he had to have taken damage from that. If Etherean couldn't do anything, muttered Sting, what chance do we have? It's not right, Wendy muttered, catching Laxus's attention at the tone she had taken. It was the same one she had when she had become captivated before by her sight, and that alone was enough to make him listen. He's odd. He looks different. Before he could even ask for what she meant by that, Acknowledge moved. The shockwave from the sky had caused him to turn back, but by that time Acknowledge had landed in front of them, magic swirling around his palm in an uncontrollable manner. Perish. The energy was unleashed like a bomb, exploding outwards towards them like an unstoppable wave, before he kicked into action, darting part at full speed as lightning as he threw his right arm forward. Lightning burst forth from it in massive amounts, buying him time as the two magic clashed before his own was wiped out. The others had similar ideas, Natsu's flames roaring to life before he was destroyed entirely. He supposed it was no surprise though. Acknowledge had probably chosen to land closest to Natsu for this reason alone. Before the rest of the energy could reach them, and it was getting far too close even with his speed, walls of ice shot up in the dozens, providing layer after layer for the energy to smash against. Even that wasn't enough to stop it, but it was more than enough for them to all scatter away from the attack. Wendy! Gajeel called out. You brought me here. Bring my armor too. Right. Wendy called back quickly, waving her hand before a mass of iron appeared right over Gajeel. If the Dragon Slayer found the placement annoying, he didn't say it. Instead he leapt up to the iron as it fell towards him, the iron parting with his touch and allowing him access within. Oh no you don't! Roared Acknowledge, reaching the dragon's mouth before it was even fully active and throwing the dragon to one side, the iron smashing against the ground as it skid across into the distance. In that moment God Serena made his move, appearing behind Acknowledge with his fist drawn back and pure energy coating his skin. I don't believe this. The man roared. He swung, his fist colliding with the back of Acknowledge's head and sending him flying down towards the ground. You took damage. I know you did. He had to have done, called out Toshiro in reassurance, brandishing his sword in front of him as he coated with ice till it was 10 times its original size. He's got to be hurt. Swinging his sword downwards, it stopped right before it reached the ground, held up at the tip by Acknowledge, the ice cracking under his grip. Believe what you will, Acknowledge spoke coldly to them. Even with all that, you will not win. The ice shattered, revealing Laxus himself as his cover was blown. It didn't matter however, his hand held out and letting all the stored energy he had built being unleashed and shaped. Golden light surrounded his weapon as he swung, half-formed but enough for what he needed. Dragon Slayer's secret fairy art, thunder-piercing lance. Pathetic, was Acknowledge's only response, shattering his strongest spell with a massive wave of magic in return. The excess lightning shot out in all directions as the spell's form shattered, and before he had a chance to blink he was being thrown across the ground, rolling across the ground countless times until he finally came to a stop. Looking up, the sight before him was already looking worse. God Serena was striking again, but the attack was overpowered in an instant by one of Acknowledge's own, and he heard the loud crack as Acknowledge's foot connected with God Serena's knee suddenly. The moment the man was forced to kneel, a sword flew over his head, easily dodged. But before Acknowledge could back away, Toshiro had grabbed the dragon by his head and froze him entirely solid. In the next moment, the ice statue was up dozens of miles in the air and falling rapidly. He vaguely hoped it would hit the ground before Acknowledge could even have a chance to escape, but the ice shattered far too quickly, Acknowledge's wings spreading out and stopping his fall. We can't win. He glanced towards the source of those words, Sting standing there. No, he was frozen if anything. The man hadn't even made a single move to try and retaliate. We can't beat him. Don't give up. He's going to try and kill you regardless. But what's the point of all of this? Muttered Sting. If Etherean did nothing, what chance do we even have? We're still alive, aren't we? Laxus shot back. We only need to kill Acknowledge, not beat him in power. That hasn't changed. Find an opening, strike, and keep hoping something works. That won't be enough, muttered Sting. How can we hope to beat something that, what? Sting's eyes began to water before his very eyes, a look of disbelief appearing on his face. That voice. Sting. Don't you hear him? Sting demanded, turning to Laxus in an instant before he winced and was forced to clutch his head in pain. My head, it's splitting. But I know this voice. Voice? What are you talking about? The voice of my father. Without waiting to explain what he meant, Sting was rushing forward, Laxus being forced to follow behind to avoid letting the Dragon Slayer charge in alone. Hold up. Your father? What do you mean? I can hear him. I shouldn't be able to. I killed him. But I can hear him now, plain as day. And he's telling me to get real close to Acknowledge. And you're sure that's not your mind with a death wish? He shouted back. Considering the sudden flip in actions, it wouldn't surprise him if Sting had lost himself in panic. Let's try and regroup with the others and dash. That won't work. Acknowledge will keep tearing us apart. Unless we overwhelm him now. Darting forward faster, Sting's speed outpacing his own, he could only watch as the Dragon Slayer shot towards Acknowledge as a beam of light, returning to normal at the last moment just in time to slam his feet against the dragon's back and use him as a springboard to leap upwards. Catch me if you can. He couldn't understand what Sting was planning. The man shot upwards into the sky as light, but Acknowledge was racing after him. What was the point of all of this? What was he planning? This sky has changed so very much. He paused at the sound of that voice. He didn't recognize it, and he glanced around quickly hoping someone else did. His attention was quickly drawn to Wendy herself, odd-colored air forming around her and slowly drifting upwards. He almost thought it was something she was doing, at least until he saw the tears in her eyes. I'm sorry we took so long, Wendy. Wendy! What's happening? He shouted over, but Wendy didn't react to him at all, instead peering up at the rising air. Wendy! I don't understand, muttered Toshiro as the Shinigami joined him. What's happening? He didn't have an answer for that, but soon he didn't even have time to think of one. Not when the very sky lit up, as if a second sun had appeared and was wiping out all the darkness. That was when he saw Acknowledge begin to fall, and at great speed too. By the time Acknowledge had begun to recover, Gajeel had also returned, the mass of iron he was flying rushing straight at Acknowledge. It wouldn't be enough, he realized, though, Acknowledge having already recovered from his fall. At least that was what he thought, up until the front of the iron dragon shattered and revealed what he could only describe as the real thing. In an instant, he knew what he was seeing wasn't false. The dragon before them slammed straight into Acknowledge, head first, and sent him flying. It didn't stop there either, chasing Acknowledge down with a furious roar. It wasn't going to work, however. He could see Acknowledge recovering, he could hear the roar their enemy made out of sheer fury, and as dozens of orbs formed from Acknowledge's magic, he doubted it even would stand a chance despite being what it was. All those thoughts lasted until the second appeared, out of the odd air that had been released from Wendy's body. The second dragon, with feathery wings more like those found on a bird, soared upwards at breakneck speeds, Acknowledge bearing having time to avoid its claws as they slashed through the air at him. In his haste his magic was released too early, some of the blasts skimming the first dragon's scales but none making a direct hit. Acting quickly, Acknowledge brought the first dragon's charge to a halt, grabbing him by the head with one hand and using his wings to spot their combined momentum as he was forced along the sky. Before Acknowledge could even finish and retaliate, what he could only describe as a rain of light was released from up above, blinding Acknowledge right before a massive dragon of pure light shot towards him and sent him flying towards the ground. Without even realizing it, he found himself getting drawn closer. The dragons were fighting Acknowledge, which meant they weren't their enemies. And looking at Wendy's reaction, remembering how Sting had reacted, and seeing how one of them had appeared from within Gajeel's dragon armor, he had a feeling who these dragons were. "Well, I'll be," muttered Zeref as the dark mage appeared beside him. "They actually survived, after all of this time. You knew." He tried to not sound angry, but he could tell he had failed. "I had suspicions, but nothing to confirm them. And after so long fighting, I came to believe that they had perished. But it appears they are too stubborn to simply disappear." "That is right," the first of the dragons stated, coated in massive scales that amazingly didn't seem to weight him down from how he was flying in the sky. "As if I, Metallicana, the sturdiest of my race, would die so easily. My scales have not broken yet, and as long as they haven't I will be the shield that protects you all this day." "Being a bit dramatic today, are we?" "Say the second of the dragons. But I suppose only one of you here remembers me. I doubt Acknowledge paid enough attention when he first slaughtered us." "I remember you," Acknowledge's voice growled out. "I remember all of you." "Is that so? Then don't mind if I introduce myself once more for the sake of the others. I am the last of the creatures born of the sky. There is no creature freer than myself, and there has never been anywhere I couldn't reach with these wings of mine. I am Grandini, the last of the dragons blessed with magic's sight. And I do not appreciate all the pain you have caused my precious daughter to endure. You're all dead. I killed you." "Well, you didn't do a very good job of it then," the third dragon spoke up, the intensity of the dragon's body having dimmed slightly since his first appearance. "I am the light that shines in the bleakest of darknesses, illuminating a path for those who follow. I am Vicelage, a dragon you killed Acknowledge, and I don't plan on disappearing just yet until we've had our revenge." "Three's not bad," muttered Zeref from beside Laxus. "But we're missing one." "What?" "Yes. Probably the most important of them all." "He'll be here," Metallicana growled out. "Probably just trying to make a dramatic entrance." "I think it's more that he has been waiting for this moment for some time," Grandini said instead, looking towards the rising pillar of flames nearby and feeling as the heat all around them began to rise. "It's been so long for him. I'm sure he just wants a chance to speak to his son while he can." "Protector of the fairies. Hey Natsu? You doing okay?" Natsu glanced up at the voice, mirroring the actions of his younger self, and watched as his brother kneeled down before him. "Zeref. You're back." He was only slightly behind his younger self, but he already knew the words. They would just find their way to his head, as if knowing that was what he wanted to said. Or had said. Or would say. It was hard to tell anymore. He had stopped reading the book of End long ago, but that hadn't stopped the knowledge from the book from continuing. A doorway had been opened and he had peered too deep, and now it couldn't be shut as everything on the other end flooded into his head. His surroundings were in constant flux now, moving from memory to memory. He hadn't lived these, and yet he had been the child in every single one of them. Merely watching them reminded him of what he had lost, and eventually it had gotten to a point that he had found himself living out the memories as they were shown to him. There were moments though that he could realize the difference. To grasp a brief reprieve. Such moments were ones that he couldn't replicate, like right now with his younger self's stomach rumbling. But the time these reprieves was growing shorter, and he knew he was to blame. The more he watched, the less he could separate himself from this child. The less he wanted to. Hungry Natsu? Ziref asked him, the tone taken the same one he had noticed when Ziref had first revealed the truth to him. Only the way he spoke now, the emotion he put into his voice, it made the previous memory a mere shell of what he had once been like. The Ziref in these memories though, it was a Ziref filled with such kindness. He didn't know how much he had been influenced by his younger self already, but he couldn't dismiss the feelings he had in his heart at moments like this. Ziref was his brother. And he loved that fact. Like his younger smile, he was smiling up at his brother, even though he had to crouch a lot to keep level with the two of them. Don't worry, Ziref said, reaching towards a sack he had on his back and pulling out a small loaf of bread. There was barely anything to it, it was even moldy in places, but his younger self accepted it without a problem. If anything, he was smiling wider, and he understood why from all he had seen. This piece of food was a wonderful treat. With him so young, Ziref had to do everything to make sure they survived. Which meant searching for food wherever he could. He had seen a village in the distance, but the memories were so vague on that side. He doubted he had ever even been there, and going by the rough things he had heard Ziref say, he knew he didn't want to. This house had its problems, but he was fine so long as Ziref was there. Glancing at his younger self, he felt himself mirroring the actions he was taking until he snapped himself out of it. He couldn't eat in a memory, and yet he couldn't stop himself from trying anyway. By the time his younger self had finished eating, he couldn't ignore the phantom sensation of hunger. He almost thought it was his stomach rumbling this time before he realized it was still his younger self. Still hungry, huh? I guess it has been a tough week, Ziref stated before glancing back into the sack he had. He paused for a moment, glancing at something within, before pulling out a red juice apple. He knew he shouldn't have felt like this, but he could feel his eyes sparkling at the sight of it. What's that? Was that him speaking alone? Or both of him? It was hard to tell. It's shiny. It's an apple. One of the shopkeepers had a load on sale, and I think he must have accidentally mixed in a few good ones too when he was trying to get rid of the bad ones. Lucky us, huh? He felt himself nodding, understanding what his brother didn't. His younger self had noticed but the blood on Ziref's sleeve when he had arrived, but he hadn't know what it was. That hadn't been a problem for him, and he had a better grasp over all of the things his younger self didn't. He knew his brother wasn't exactly liked in town, and that he was treated harshly. That it wasn't uncommon for him to come back with torn clothes or dried blood somewhere on his body. He was never injured though. But then he figured it wasn't something Ziref wanted him to see. It was a burden Ziref wanted to bear alone, as the older brother and one who protected him. It was also how he knew that this apple wasn't one Ziref had managed to buy or trade for. They didn't have the money for that if they had to survive off scraps. Which meant Ziref had taken a chance and stolen this, and had gotten hurt because of it. All for his sake, because he hadn't had much to eat recently and Ziref wanted to surprise him. Happy birthday, Natsu. He paused beside his younger self, the confused look he directed up mirrored by his younger self. Huh? You didn't know? Ziref reached out towards him and ruffled his younger self's head, making him jealous of the sight for a moment. Don't worry. I'll always remember. It's not much, but hopefully this will be a nice present for today. He could only nod, a beaming smile on his face as he took the apple and took a large bite out of it. He couldn't stop the satisfied noise that escaped his lips at the taste, his eyes positively shining before he looked back up at his brother, holding the apple out. He saw his brother hesitate. Had he not expected this? Why wouldn't he want to share? Ziref was everything to him after all, so he didn't mind if he got some of his present too. Ah, don't worry about me, Natsu. It's your present. For once he was quite defiant. Most of the time he did what Ziref told, or rather suggested, him to do. But this time he didn't relent, forcing the apple up to Ziref's mouth. All right, Ziref said with a chuckle, giving in and taking a bit. Even as he took it back and continued to eat the rest, a happy smile on his face, he knew Ziref hadn't eaten much. He'd barely touched it, taking the smallest bit possible. He knew why. Ziref didn't eat. He didn't seem to need to, even if it did cause him pain, and because of that he gave everything he had to him. It was hard enough to find food for one person, let alone two, so Ziref abandoned any attempts at sustaining himself. Ziref knew he'd live, and so everything he found became his instead. Did his younger self understand this yet? Of how far Ziref went for them? He had a feeling he did on some level. Because he adored Ziref, more than anything else in the world. A feeling like that wasn't born out of anything but love. The sound of a book cover slamming shut pulled his head to the side, noticing the book of END resting there on the ground innocently. Glancing up, he realized the surroundings had changed once more, being replaced by a familiar sight. Well, mostly familiar. It was Magnolia, the guild hall to be exact, except with one difference. It was all up in flames. As far as the eye could see, flames were present. They were burning away everything in sight, reducing what had once been a massive city of his home to a small ruin until even that was burnt away. Subconsciously he was sure he knew what this meant. Magnolia and Fairy Tale were his home. It wouldn't be wrong to say that he built his life around them and that they were always in his thoughts. And this destruction was undoubtedly because he was slowly losing that. But he didn't care. His eyes continued to wander, looking desperately for that familiar presence. This way, Ziref. His eyes snapped towards the noise, spotting his younger self walking along and dragging his brother by the hand. Wait, he found himself muttering, a hand raised towards them hesitantly. Don't go. All right, Natsu, let's go, he heard Ziref say, ignoring him and listening only to his younger self. He didn't want that. Don't leave me, he muttered, almost like he was in a trance. He took one step forward, and then another, until he was running after them. But they were getting further away anyway. Every step he made took him further into the flames, and yet he wasn't making any progress towards the two. No matter how desperately he reached out towards them, no matter how fast he ran, they were just beyond his reach. No. Don't go. Ziref. I'm still here. Wait for me. Please. Brother. Wait. Why was he running? Wasn't there something else he had to do? Why was he even here in the first place? Hurry, Ziref. Those thoughts vanished the moment he heard those words, realizing in his confusion that he had fallen further behind. It was like rocks were tied to his legs as he tried to catch up, weighing him down with every step, and for the first time in a long while he actually could feel the heat of flames as they became to consume him. He didn't care though, desperately chasing after that one thought in his mind. To get to his brother. He didn't want to be separated. Not when they were finally together again. Being alone was so painful. More painful than these flames. So he'd run, uncaring about what he had to leave behind, to remove this feeling. Was that wrong? He didn't think so. He was getting closer anyway, Ziref actually turning around and looking at him, the older him, for once. It was just for a moment, but then he was turning away again, leaving him once more. No. Please. Don't leave me. Where are you going, Natsu? He felt himself come to a halt at those words. He was half aware that his younger self and Ziref had stopped too, and that even the flames had suddenly calmed from their previous blaze. It was like his whole mind had been brought to a halt at once, all from those words. Because he knew who said them. It was a voice he could always remember, even as everything else dimmed in his mind. The voice of one who could still compete with the love his younger self had for Ziref. He was hesitant to turn around. What if he had imagined it? What if this was just another dead end like it always was? He was afraid. Why wasn't the voice saying anything else? If it would say even another word, he could ignore it. He could run right back after his younger self and Ziraf right now. But, he had to know. He always had to know, even when it had hurt to fail each and every time. And so he turned, his eyes glancing up and beginning to water. "Hello Natsu," Igneel, his father, said to him, the massive form of the dragon towering over him in a way only he would have ever found comforting. "I'm so happy to see you again, my son. Protector of the fairies. The boy and his dragon. I'm dreaming, right? Dreaming? Well, I guess I am pretty amazing. I wouldn't be surprised if you were dreaming about me." Natsu blinked a few times, looking at the giant dragon before him as if it would vanish without warning. "You'll, real? But, this is my mind." Igneel nodded. "It is. Then, how can you be real?" His eyes hardened slight, looking at the image of his foster father in distrust. "This is another trick, isn't it? Just like this place, right? You're one of my brothers dash. You've grown quite used to calling him that, haven't you?" He froze at Igneel's words. "I don't know what dash." "Yes you do. You know exactly what I mean. Tell me, where are we right now?" Frowning, Natsu glanced from side to side. Around them was the only calm place in the entire storm of flames, consuming everything in sight. He could still make out the shapes of buildings and houses within the inferno, but he hadn't a clue who they belonged to. But he knew what this place was. Its name was, what was it? How about another question? Tell me the name of one of your friends. Tell me the name of someone close to you. He frowned, struggling to recall memories he knew were there. But every time he kept either coming up blank or running face first into memories of Ziraf. "Though I know her face," he muttered hesitantly. "She's got white hair, cut short, and I can almost remember her name. Something beginning with L." When he glanced up though, he didn't expect to see a smug knowing look being thrown his way. "What? My, it seems my son really has grown up a lot. Is she your girlfriend?" He couldn't help but blush from embarrassment. "What the hell? What are you talking about, old man? I don't even remember anything." He trailed off, realizing he had said far too much. "You don't remember anything more than that is what I assume you would going to say." "I am, to be honest, not that surprised. She must be very precious to you for you to still remember even a fragment of her existence." "I haven't forgotten you." "Is that you're doing?" Igneel shook his head. "As much as I would like to take the credit, that's all you." Glancing around the world, Igneel expanded on his words. "A lot of this is my own observations. Based on what I have seen, however, I think I have a good grasp on what END does to you when the seal is open like it has been. It immediately unleashes all its stored memories, forcefully flooding them through you and ensuring you begin to assimilate with each and every one of them. The main goal is, of course, to swallow your consciousness and have it burnt away, leaving only END. Then my memories. Are they?" He couldn't even finish those words. Was there anything left if he could barely remember anything right now? But, he could still remember Igneel clearly. Each and every memory that involved him, even if some of the less relevant details were harder to grasp. "And why do I remember you so clearly?" "One at a time, please. In regards to the memories you cannot remember, they are not lost. So long as you are still here, they exist. They are just being suppressed right now by the weight of E.N.D's own. His own raw emotion is a powerful weapon, as is his love for Ziraf. In a lot of cases, it makes it easy to suppress your own since they can't compete with the sheer strength associated with them. But your memories of me are different than most of your memories," Igneel said with pride. "You cherish me just as much as END cherishes Ziraf. A bond strong enough to resist even when being overwhelmed by so many memories and so much emotion. I am honored even that you loved me enough to forget me." "That's right. I do love you." His head snapped up towards Igneel, tears glistening in his eyes as flames fired up uncontrollably around his body. "I adored you. And you left me." "I did. And I'm sorry," Igneel said, bowing his head. It was not something I wanted to do, but I dash. Do you know how long I looked for you? Do you know how I felt that day? Natsu asked. He couldn't help but be happy at the sight of the dragon in front of him, but there was more than that to feel. Anger. Pain. How long had he waited for this day? How many questions had he been waiting desperately to ask? You left me. I woke up without a clue where I was, and when I looked around you were nowhere to be seen. I have a reason for that. And I don't care. He roared out. He wanted the answer, he really did. But there were things he had to say. Things he had bottled away for years. He couldn't quite remember his first few years at Fairy Tale, but he could remember the loneliness he had felt. He could remember just sitting out there in the rain, looking out into the distance waiting for a figure who would never come. When I woke up, I thought you just went hunting, he muttered. Then I thought you had gotten lost. Then I thought you had gotten distracted. Then I thought you had gotten into trouble. And then days passed and I even considered the worst. I knew it couldn't be true, you were unbeatable to me, but you weren't coming back. I was there for a month before anyone found me, he snarled out. I hadn't left that clearing. I would find what food I could to sustain me nearby and I'd spend the rest of the days waiting. Near the end I was setting half the forest on fire, tree by tree, in the vague hope that you would see it and fly back. And you never did, he muttered, trying not to shed tears and finding himself unable to stop. It was Gramps who found me in the end. The people living nearby apparently thought there was a demon in the woods. Well, they were kind of right. Gramps was passing through on his way back from a meeting with another guild and went to check on the disturbance. He's the one who finally got me to leave. If it wasn't for him, I would have died waiting for you. I know Natsu. You know? You know? What the hell do you know? Natsu roared out, not even bothering to hold back his tears anymore as his pain mixed into his rage. Gramps did the best he could. He gave me a family, but I still couldn't forget you. I could wanted to see you again. So I went and searched. I'd spend almost all my earnings from missions to search every place I could think of. I'd pay people ridiculously amounts of money for even the slightest rumor of a dragon, no matter how legitimate it truly was. The very instant I heard of even a possible sighting, I dropped everything to look for you. And every time I did, I expected to find you less and less. Natsu. I could have stopped any time I wanted, he added on. I thought about doing that so many times. I would get so excited despite myself in the beginning every time I followed a lead. I'd think, hey, maybe this is the one, and run after the trail with a smile. And then I'd reach the end and be hit by the same feeling of disappointment. And each time I did that, I got less excited and more disappointed. Eventually I dreaded even hearing a rumor about you. It would have brought me less pain if I just ignored the rumors I heard. But what if that was the one that was right? What if I missed you because I ignored the one true sighting? I couldn't take the chance. But I didn't want to hear about them either. Tugging at the scarf around his neck, he unraveled it from his neck and held it in his hands. I couldn't even bear to take this stupid thing off for too long. No matter how much pain it brought me when it reminded me of you, I couldn't get rid of it. But this scarf, and you, were like a curse sometimes. A mere tale and I'm out the door, putting on a face smile and trying not to look like I'm dreading what's at the end of the stupid rainbow I'm following. And now you appear in front of me? Now, of all times? He asked. Well, I wanted you earlier. I wanted to see you so many times before now. But if you're here, then I guess you've always been here. Right? Igneel slowly nodded. Yes. I have been here, all of this time. It pained me, to watch you struggle and wait for me. To continue your searches. But there was nothing I could do. Nothing? You really think that? Waving one hand outwards, he gestured at the world around them. This is my mind, isn't it? You've been here all this time, haven't you? I searched everywhere, and yet you were always there with me. So why didn't you say something? Why didn't you say anything? You didn't need a voice in your head telling you things, Natsu. You don't get to decide that. I needed you. All I wanted was to see you again. To ask. I'm here now. Go ahead. His hands tightened around his scarf, pulling it against his chest for support. Why? He asked quietly, the anger slowly leaving his voice until only the pain he felt remained as tears streaked down his face. Why did you leave me? He had always wanted to know. Always wanted that answer. He couldn't even meet his father's eyes as he asked this, too afraid of what the answer would be. He had waited years for the answers he saw, and now that he was about to get them he was terrified of what they would be. I just want to know that, he muttered brokenly, choking up between sobs as he let it all out. Did I do something wrong? Was I not good enough? If you have told me I would have worked harder. I would have done anything. So why did you leave me? Why did you leave me all alone? Igneel didn't answer him at first, causing him to clutch his scarf tighter. What was he going to hear? He had dreamt of this moment for years, had seen all the good that could have come from it, and yet right now all he could think was all the bad ways this could go and he was finding it hard to breathe and then all of those fears were brushed away at the feeling of a large hand being pressed against his back, pulling him against the side of his father's head. Natsu. I'm so sorry. He couldn't help it. He immediately pressed himself into the scales, crying freely as he felt the familiar warmth he had missed so much. I always wanted to see you again. Not a day went by that I didn't want to answer your prayers. But I couldn't. The truth is, I was dead the day you woke up. He felt himself free, slowly pushing himself off his father to look him squarely in the face. Dead? No. That's not right. I would have seen something. Unless, did I forget? But I don't. This isn't a memory you will recover, Natsu, Igneel softly said to him. You were young at the time, and the journey forward in time was interrupted near the end. Forward, in time. You know you are Ziref's brother, but the legends of End existed long ago during his precious reign of terror. And then they stopped. That's because for almost 400 years, End was actual incapable of being unleashed. Did you steal me from him? Igneel let out a bitter laugh. Not quite. Truth be told, I was not truly aware that you were End when I took you in. In fact, I had been trying to kill End during that time period. If I had known you were End when I first met you. But then I suppose that was why Ziref introduced you to be as Natsu, and had your power sealed away within that book. He knew I would train you if I believed you were an ordinary human child, just like the other dragons were doing with their newly found children. I believe you know some of them. Wendy, Natsu muttered. The first time I met her, I felt like I knew her from somewhere. She smelled familiar. Ah yes. Grandini's child. I met her very briefly. Such a quiet girl, with such an odd dragon. But then I suppose she might have thought the same about me. I do remember that you and Wendy were such good friends back then, playing with that other child that Metallicana had taken in. There were others of course, but in the end the last of your generation were you three and the children raised by Vislaja and Skyadrum. Perhaps this will help, Igneel muttered as he glanced to one side, raising a large hand towards the scenery beside them and causing it to change. It flickered between forms for a moment, the flames trying to remain, before it finally managed to stabilize on a familiar sight. Is that the Eclipse Gate? Natsu muttered. I thought you might recognize it. Indeed, this is the gate that you faced not too long ago and saw destroyed. Apologizes if the memory is not so clear. You will be seeing through my eyes for part of it. Your eyes? This is your memory? But how dash? Where do you think we are, Natsu? I'll admit I'm not quite as talented to put on the show you have witnessed from End, but in a malleable place like this I am more than capable of projecting my own for you to view. Gesturing towards the memory, Igneel drew his attention towards the sight of multiple dragons approaching. These were my friends. No, I don't think that's quite right. Allies perhaps is better. I was too stubborn back then to truly reach out to others, too arrogant too, and so I never connected with them as much as I would have liked to now. Death has a way of bringing all things into perception. Natsu merely nodded, watching curiously as the dragons landed. When was this? This, Igneel spoke softly, was near the end of the Great War of my race. I don't suppose history remembers much of it, but there were once thousands of us. And I like to think that we were a magnificent race. Few could fight us, and some of us were truly powerful even by today's standards. But we were also like any other race. We were kind, but also cruel. We would protect, but also feast. For every dragon that believed we should live alongside humanity, there was another that believed they should be devoured as food. I assume you were the former. Igneel shrugged. I honestly didn't care too much. I lead a large tribe of dragons and my reputation was known far and wide. But I personally had no interest in humans back then. I didn't care if we protected them or ate them. If they wandered into my territory, I'd force them out. That was all that concerned me. A lot of the dragons that followed me liked that. They were tired of the same pointless arguments that erupted between our kind. Things would have stayed that way, until war broke out. I don't know who caused it, Igneel admitted. Perhaps it was the group of dragons that had united together with humans in an attempt to push back the dragons they deemed evil. Perhaps it was the dragons feasting too much in too great numbers, provoking a dramatic response from all who opposed them. Rather of what was the trigger, it was the rallying call for our species, and soon we found ourselves picking sides. My neutrality lasted for some time, but even that was fleeting, and I joined the side of those that wished to protect humans. Igneel slowly let out a disappointed sigh at his own words. That was a mistake. What was? Protecting us? I wouldn't have thought you would have gotten along with the other side. My mistake was getting involved in the first place. I am strong, Natsu. Stronger than I ever showed you. And that strength brought with it pain for those that faced me. Before I entered the battle, the tide was pretty even. The dragon slayers that had been brought into existence were still growing, yet to have gained full maturity with their abilities, and so the real turning point in such conflicts were those of us with great power. In particular, there was a powerful dragon by the name of Gvantis that was a rallying point to many of the enemy. Even I had heard of him, and the number of settlements he had systematically destroyed and devoured. He sounds strong, Natsu muttered. You fought him, didn't you? Igneel slowly shook his head. No, I didn't fight him. That would imply there was a fight. My first act of the war was arriving at that battlefield and killing that dragon in a sea of fire. That day ended with overwhelming victory, the enemy in full retreat. After that day, the enemy started fighting dirtier. They too brought out dragon slayers, brought up as slaves to them to kill and only kill. They stopped rampaging recklessly and began to fight smart, and on occasion even drew us into traps where we would end up getting too close to the empires of the Shinigami or the Quincy. Their leaders never took kindly to our appearances. Eventually though, the war ended, Igneel said. But it wasn't because we managed to settle our differences. Nor was it because one side won the war. We both lost, because Acknowledge appeared. Natsu nodded. I heard about that. That he killed a whole lot of you and brought you all to extinction. Saying he killed a lot of us. That would be putting it lightly. He had struck multiple times during the war, taking advantage of the chaos. At first both sides assumed he was one of the enemy's dragon slayers. It was only as time passed did we begin to hear tales of the same individual fighting against both of us. It didn't matter to Acknowledge what side we were or what our ideologies were. All he cared about was that we were dragons, the target of his hatred. I've yet to know if he was created because of us, Igneel admitted. We lost so many dragons that none of us truly know who was the one to grant him Dragon Slayer magic. But he rose beyond any expectations we had of Dragon Slayers, and even showed us the dragons they posed to by becoming a dragon himself. I heard many in the enemy camp actual killed their Dragon Slayers when they heard this news, and I don't doubt the same happened on our side too. No one wanted a second Acknowledge. And in the end, we tried to end it in one final battle. Igneel sighed, bringing a hand up against his chest. I still feel the pain from that battle, despite my form in here. That day was the one day us dragons came together as one. It was all to fight a common foe. Hundreds of dragons populated the sky, so many that we blocked out anything else. I still remember how Acknowledge looked that day. He smiled. He laughed. We should have realized that all we had done was bring the lot of us to him, but we had believed we could surpass him together. We were fools. He is strong, Natsu agreed. But could he have really beaten all of you? I know we weren't able to do much against him, but if there were hundreds of you. We pushed him to his limits, Igneel revealed. We hit him with our strongest blows when we had the chance. We fought with all our strength, and we wounded him time after time. But acknowledge, he wouldn't stop. Even bleeding from injuries all across his body, he continued to fight, climbing over the mountain of corpses he was making while still showing that same smile, practically begging for us to keep charging in. And when some of us began to flee, he roared. It still echoes in my head to this day, a beam of pure energy wider than any other being unleashed and consuming everything before the horizon. Pointing towards the memory, where they could see the dragon slayers playing with one another in front of the eclipse gate, Igneel added, this was not long after that battle. I had barely escaped with my life, as had the others with me. On this day, our great numbers had dwindled down to around 20, and we were hardly a threat to acknowledge any longer. And yet he kept hunting us, like a madman chasing after his obsession. We had to think of something, Igneel stated, gazing at the memory as a familiar individual appeared from the shadows. And that was when he had appeared. Zeref, the one responsible for Acknowledge's creation. Scowling at the sight of the man in his memory, Igneel appeared to be unable to hide his anger at his brother. It was an odd sight to see on his father, admittedly. For as long as he remembered, he had never seen Igneel look like this before. We didn't want to trust him. Zeref even admitted that he had helped Acknowledge grow because he wanted a weapon to wipe us out. He claimed that our vast numbers would one day become a threat to his plans. But he underestimated just how strong Acknowledge would become. That monster became so powerful that his own creator could no longer kill him, and for the man who always has dolls fight for him, he had likely never encountered something rebelling against his will. Or at least not something that he couldn't easily eliminate. And so a plan was devised, Igneel added as he turned towards him. It was risky, but we had seen the power of humanity when given the right tools. If Acknowledge had become a dragon, one of the only weapons left to give those a chance after we were gone were dragon slayers. Together, the others and I gathered 5 children who would inherit our magic. You, Gajeel, Wendy, Sting, and finally Rogue. I had hoped when this day arrived that the 5 of you would have stood here against this foe, but I guess fate wasn't so kind to you. What about the Eclipse Gate? He muttered, glancing at the sight of it within the memory. I know the basics of that thing. It's a gateway those in the future used to travel back in time with. Almost, Igneel corrected. How did Zeref explain it again? I believe he described it as a path between 2 points. People can travel back, but people can also travel forward. You experienced that when dragons invaded your time, and I will admit I was surprised myself when that happened. We noticed 400 years ago when a large enemy force disappeared and we had never managed to work out what happened to them. But ignoring that, that gateway works both ways, as you have seen. So long as the points are connected, one can traverse the path in either direction. The only limitation is that you can only travel to a time in which the gate exists, which means if it is in pieces for a few years, then those few years are inaccessible to you. But you'd need someone to open it in the future, right? How did you account for that? Time travel has always been tricky, muttered Igneel distastefully. Zeref set the wheels in motion to ensure the gateway would be opened 400 years in the future, but we have no way to truly know if he was being truthful when we stepped into the gateway. Our only escapes would be the points where it was opened beyond that point, and it would be so easy to miss our target. We had to trust Zeref would keep his word, and we have no idea what means he went through to do so either. Hey, who's that? Natsu suddenly asked, looking as a blonde woman appeared in the memory. I think I know her. That was Anna. Anna Hardfilia. Hardfilia? But that's... He frowned, trying to remember the name of the person he knew that surname belonged to. You know her descendant, I assume. Your memory is starting to return as well, thanks to my presence keeping E.N.DS at bay. That is good. Lucy. She's Lucy's ancestor, he muttered quietly, finally remembering his old friend's name. But she's still familiar. Like. I should know her. Know her personally, not because she looks familiar. I wouldn't be surprised. She helped raise all of you with us in the beginning. It was important to get all of you children accustomed to her as soon as possible, since she was the one meant to go with you. She was the one also meant to open the eclipse gate on this side, and it would be opened by the bearer of all 12 keys in the future. To go with us? So you did plan to leave? Yes, though not in the way you might think, Igneel admitted regretfully. There were many reasons for us to flee to the future. The first was the time it would bring. None of us believed Acknowledgea would simply die in that time. Zeref agreed with us that it was likely Acknowledgea would simply wait. Wait until we revealed ourselves, and during that time we hoped he would merely isolated himself while he bided his time. 400 years without a dragon to hunt would dull his senses, and buy you all the time you would need to grow up. With his diminished senses and your own humanity, it would be hard to recognize that dragons had arrived in the world again. But you must have arrived with us at least. We did. But we could never go as we were. If we had, everything would have gone to waste. Acknowledgea would have found us all in days if we were lucky. Hours at worst. We needed you all to be safe, in a future where hopefully humans had progressed far enough along that they would bring about strong mages and allies for you in the eventual conflict. We had never expected individuals like Laxistriar, the Okinsarina, or Taushiro Hichugaya to exist, and we're glad they joined you for this battle. Stop beating around the bush, Natsu demanded impatiently. What did you do? We died. Perhaps it will be clearer if you watch. Igneel gestured towards the memory, drawing his focus back to it as he noticed the large dragon behind a little Wendy beginning to sing. She's singing. Grandini was quite the special dragon. Even amongst our kind, those of the sky were rare. Blessed. And she was the strongest of them all. Apparently she had even come into contact with Anukin decades before, and had traveled with her for some time until she eventually perished from something Grandini seemed loath to talk about. That time left its mark on her, and she eventually learned to guide her will through song to amazing effect. She didn't need magic circles when she could shape her magic in a way far more natural to her, and with that it opened new avenues for her to adjust existing techniques. What she did was one of them. Natsu watched carefully as light appeared to create a filter across the memory, as if Igneel himself was being blinded in the memory. That was when everything became weird, the memory he was seeing distorting as he was pulled through space until it finally settled once more, down at the level of a child. She implanted you all in us, he muttered in realization, seeing the lingering energy of the other dragons being pulled into the bodies of his fellow dragon slayers. He could only assume the same was happening with his child self, which meant he must have been looking through his own eyes right now. He frowned though as he noticed the bodies of the dragons behind the children somehow still moving. Wait. If you lot went in us, who are they? Our decoys, Igneel muttered, watching the memory too as the dragons began to fly away into the distance, letting out loud roars as they scattered. Acknowledgea was close on our trail every step of the way. Every day we got came at a cost. And by this day we were almost out of time. Acknowledgea was already catching up to us, having caught our scent, so we did the only thing we could do. We made ourselves decoys. You're confused, Igneel added, seeing the look he was giving his father. What Grandini did was something she hopes Wendy will never learn how to do. She began to pull our souls from our bodies, implanting them within the magic of you children, and then severed the connection before it finished. A piece of our souls were left behind in our bodies, effectively creating two of us, and those clones took our bodies and fled to draw Acknowledgea away. Your body. Then what happens if you leave me? I'll survive for a brief while, Igneel admitted. Dragons are creatures of magic. We can use our own souls for fuel for a time, but the magic we have is limited without a way to replenish it. We can remake a physical form, but once our magic runs out then we will fade. And, given enough time, we would have eventually faded away too even if we never did reveal ourselves. Why though? The process is complicated but No. Why did you have to do this? He demanded, looking up at his father in confusion. Split your soul? Come with us? You've not said a word this entire time, and you have only showed up now. Was it to surprise Acknowledgea? Or was it for another reason? It was to prevent you all from becoming like Acknowledgea, Igneel stated seriously. You lot should have obtained dragon features by now with how much you have used your magic. You merely need to look at your friend Laxus to see how rapid the process can be. And yet you only take on such traits when you use dragon force. And they vanish once you stop. I thought. What could he say? He thought it was natural? He thought it was just how his magic worked. It's because of you, isn't it? You're doing something. Igneel nodded. That was the reason we needed to come with us. To save you all. For many years now we have been carefully adapting your magic to your human nature. We created antibodies in your magic from our own souls, antibodies that over time forced your magic to lose its old traits. What was a magic that would make you like us slowly became one that let you become like us, but always return back. By doing so, we prevented any of you from becoming like Acknowledge. None of you would ever become a dragon, and the threat you could have posed would never exist. Things didn't go as smoothly outside of that, Igneel admitted though, glancing at the memory as they were hurried towards the open gateway of the Eclipse Gate. One by one he saw the others go through, and then he saw himself being pulled round and enveloped in a hug by Zeref. He'll be safe, Zeref. You have my word. Yes. Because your word meant so much back then, didn't it, Anna? Without warning he saw himself get thrown backwards, falling into the Eclipse Gate and seeing the shocked look of the familiar woman. And then the memory ended, everything turning black through his young eyes. That was the last time I ever saw Anna, Igneel said sadly. The plan was that you would all arrive together and that she would keep you all safe and raise you, preparing you for the eventual battle but also letting you live the lives you could have had otherwise before we made you into weapons. But we didn't end up anywhere near each other. No, you didn't. Without a guide you lot were lucky to make it to the future, and your memories paid the price. They become distorted, yours especially thanks to your odd existence in the first place, and the plan fell to pieces. I was so thankful when Makarov found you, you don't understand just how relieved I was, and I've cursed Zeref for his betrayal ever since. Why though? He asked, confused at why that woman had to die. She was part of the plan, right? Why would Zeref purposefully sabotage it like that? We aren't sure, Igneel muttered. Anna was brought in by us. Zeref had told us he needed the bearer of the celestial spirit keys, and we had heard a rumor of a woman who had managed to obtain all 12. We convinced her to join us and she agreed, leaving behind her family and daughter for the sake of the world. Zeref was happy to accept her aid, right until she introduced herself. He knew her, Natsu muttered, glancing briefly to one side where he could still see E.N.D's presence lingering nearby, as if waiting for a chance to pounce back in. I think I remember seeing her vaguely in one of my memories. It was hazy, but I think I met her once. That might explain it why she reacted so oddly when she first met you, Igneel said in agreement. She was fine with the others. But when she met you she froze. And then she looked at Zeref, and I think that was the most furious she had ever been around us. She began to say something but he shut her up with just a glare. Well, that and the death magic that killed the plants at his feet. I know they spoke later but it wasn't my place to interfere. I should have. If I had realized that something was off earlier, I might have been able to save her. I don't know what history lay between her and Zeref, but if it involved you then I'm sure it ended badly. And he must have hated her because of it. Turning towards him, Igneel raised a hand once more before brushing it against him comfortingly. Now do you understand, my son? Why I had to leave? Where I've been all this time. I had wished I could have contacted you for so long. But I couldn't risk failing. I knew I had to produce the antibodies you would need to prevent you from falling the same path as Acknowledge, and I knew that one day you might need me again if I was still around. But no, Igneel added, that I was there to watch you every minute of your journey. I've seen you gain friends. I've seen you lose them. I've seen you smile and I've seen you cry. I've seen you grow into a fine young man, and I couldn't have been any prouder to call you the son of Igneel, the Fire Dragon King. He wasn't going to cry any further. He swore he wasn't. But he couldn't stop himself at hearing those words, words he had wanted to hear for so long from someone he had been so desperate to find. Know, Natsu, that I love you. And that I am sorry I had to leave you. But you are loved by so many others too. You have a family waiting for you still, don't you? He nodded shakily, not daring to say a word. He doubted he'd be able to be understood if he did so. Instead he just pictured all the people he wanted to say. Happy, Gray, Urza, Wendy, Happy, Elfman, Myra, Laxus, Bixlow, Freed, Evergreen, Levy, Ichigo, Taushiro, and so many others. Even those that he had lost he could still see, Lucy's smiling face alongside Gramps and even the smug look from Shinji. Everyone in Fairy Tail was his family. And then there was her. With her usual smile, filled with so much kindness and patience that had somehow let her deal with him year after year as kids, and had only grown more noticeable to him since she had returned. Listen, he muttered softly, imagining what she would say when he told her he had finally found Igneel after all these years. A lot of people had always seemed to humor him when he told people he was raised by a dragon. But her, even as kids she had believed him. She'd been able to look right through him and realized he wasn't lying or delusional. When had he first felt this way about her? He had probably always had. He just hadn't known what this emotion was until this moment. Going by that smile on your face, I think you understand, Igneel said to him, his eyes slowly rising to meet his father's. A large smile was present on his father's face, and he took in the sight like it would vanish in a heartbeat. Because he somehow knew too that they would not have much time left. How much time do you have left? Not nearly as much as I would like, Igneel admitted, his smile dropping. Talking to you in here has helped prolong it, but once I manifest, I will not last too long. You must all vanquish Acknowledge while you have the chance. With us present, Acknowledge will focus on us over you. It doesn't matter about strength to him when a dragon is present. His obsession will drive him mind and have him chasing down us if things haven't changed much with him in the past 400 years. But before that, you have to deal with that. He followed Igneel's eyes carefully, noticing how his father's gaze had landed on END. What do you mean? You are human, but you are also a demon. END represents that side of you. He represents the side of you that died long ago. But he is not you. You can move past him if you so desire. Or you can chase after Zeref once more and become him. I cannot stop you from doing so. The choice must be yours to make. But if you choose to sever yourself from Zeref, while I am in here with you I can cut the bonds that bind you to him. So I either say as myself, or I become END. He muttered, glancing between his father and the demon. It should have been an easy choice to make. Of course he would want to stay as himself. But END was powerful. Even if he wasn't aware of the events outside, he knew END was meant to be powerful. Stronger than he was. Was it truly right to ignore him when the others outside might need END more than him? Which choice was the right one? To stay human or to die and let END take over entirely? To hell with this, he muttered, slowly walking forward towards the book of END. I know the path I'm taking. Are you sure that it's the right one? Igneel asked as he reached down and picked up the book, only glancing back at his father once he had it in his hands. You will no longer be able to go back to being human if you do this. Human or demon, I don't care what I become, he shot back with a smile before turning towards END and holding out a hand to him. But the one thing I won't do is stay trapped in the past. I'll move beyond it. So why don't you come with me to E.N.D? I won't leave Zeref, he heard the small demon say, clinging to the hand of the copy of his brother. As long as Zeref needs me. I want to help him. I'll help him from here, he said calmly, reaching out and ruffling the hair of his younger self. I bet you're tired anyway. Go and play now. You don't need to fight any longer. To his surprise, END began to burn at his touch. It didn't seem like the child even noticed the heat, but he could see him breaking apart piece by piece, the energy seeming to flow towards him. You promise? Of course, he said. We're both the younger brother after all. I'll at least keep him safe from Acknowledge. Can you help him be happy again? Happy? The demon nodded, a sad smile on his face. He doesn't smile like he used to. I wanted to see him happy again. I don't know if can do that with this, Natsu muttered. I'm sorry. Oh. That's sad. I know, he muttered, and as his younger self vanished he truly did know. He could feel all those memories flowing into him, but this time they weren't overwhelming him. He could feel the echoes left behind, some memories lingering, and then the rest were gone. "Come on," he said as he turned round to Igneel, extending a hand out towards the dragon as the world around him started to correct itself. "Let's go back. Let's finish what we all started together 400 years ago." Protector of the fairies. Not quite human, not quite dragon. You accursed beasts. Die. I'm starting to think this was a bad idea. Vaislaja called out before releasing a blast of intense light from his mouth. The resulting blast forced many of them to have to look away for a moment from the sheer intensity, with only Sting and Vaislaja willingly staring into the attack. "Aw crap, that isn't stopping him," Sting muttered as Acknowledge tore right through the attack. Gripping tightly to his father, he was glad he had taken such precautions when they were suddenly soaring across the sky, the wind that they tore through desperately trying to rip him off. "He's gaining on us. Need some help." Metallicana called out with a chuckle, rushing upwards and placing himself straight in Acknowledge's path. Beside him followed a dragon of similar size, fresh iron coated where the damaged areas and turning it into something brand new. "Gajeel, shall we see how your magic holds up with my iron?" "You better be able to keep up, old man." Gajeel roared out in turn, mirroring his father as both brought one arm back. "Take this." As if looking at a bothersome fly, Acknowledge spared one look at Gajeel's strike before making adjustments to his path, allowing him to land briefly against the arm as it passed before launching himself straight into Metallicana. The Iron Dragon had only a moment to try and harden his scales before a fistful of magic slammed straight into them, the dragon letting out a roar of pain as it shattered one of his strongest defenses with a single blow. It wasn't enough to make him fall, however. Not even close. With a look of fury he swung his hand out, catching Acknowledge in it as he swept it downwards and threw the humanoid form of the dragon down towards the ground. "That's too weak." Acknowledge roared, stopping himself mid-fall as his wings spread out. He was about to charge up when a blast of wind threw him off course, capturing him within the storm being made across the sky. Grandini continued to sing as she watched her work, her magic being directed by her words as she shaped the winds to her will. At the other end waited God Serena, the Dragon Slayer, flexing his arms as he waited for Acknowledge to be flung right at him. "Almost awake, I see," he muttered to himself, hitting his chest a few times. "Come on and hurry up. Or do I need to shake you awake a bit more?" With Acknowledge too close now, though, he couldn't afford to waste any more time. Instead he swung his arms out to the side and held them there, magic pouring off them and forming many small and bright orbs within his palms. "Take this!" he shouted out, swinging his arms back forward and releasing all the orbs into the air in front of him. Each quickly began to expand as their magic was unleashed, filling the air in front of him in multiple explosions of magic that Acknowledge was incapable of avoiding. "All right, job's done. Switch!" he shouted out, just as Acknowledge came flying out of the explosions. It seemed he was using the wind to his advantage now, and it was unlikely Grandini could reverse them in time. But someone could still save him. In the blink of an eye he was gone, reappearing elsewhere while Taushiro appeared in the air above Acknowledge. Without a word he swung down at full force with his sword, ice being unleashed and smashing down into the dragon. It quickly encased the dragon without ice and caused him to slip out from the wind tunnel, rocketing towards the ground. The ice didn't last long enough for the journey, however. Acknowledge smashed his way out of his bonds before he could hit the ground, fury glowing in his eyes as he turned away from Acknowledge and took off straight through the air towards Grandini herself. "He's really quite tenacious," Grandini stated as she stopped her singing for a moment. "Laxus, would you mind running interference?" "I was already on it," Laxus said as he shot forward, turning back to normal mid-flight and forming lighting around his dragonified arm. With a challenging roar he unleashed the blast straight at Acknowledge, only for the dragon to swing an arm through it and force the energy to one side. He was half prepared for an attack when Acknowledge reached him, trying to dodge back to give himself some space, when Acknowledge practically ignored him, slamming a foot down on him and sending him flying towards the ground while also propelling himself forward towards Grandini. "Out of my way!" It didn't take Laxus long to recover, turning to lightning mid-fall and racing right back after Acknowledge. Grandini had already gone on the run, her soothing voice spreading across the battlefield as she began to sing once more and control the skies. He could tell she was trying to slow Acknowledge down, but it wouldn't last long if he decided he couldn't chase her down normally and decided to just blast her out of the sky instead. It was easy to approach him. Part of that might have been from Grandini actively making it easier for him to fly through the sky, though it could have been Wendy instead for all he knew, since she had been doing this earlier on a smaller level. But there was another more crucial reason why he was able to sneak back up on Acknowledge so easily. Acknowledge wasn't acknowledging him. Well, it wasn't just him, so to speak. He had already seen how Acknowledge had pretty much gone after Metallicana instead the second the opportunity presented himself, and even now their enemy was chasing after another dragon. If they got close he'd last out, but his choice of targets tended to always be the dragons. He'd love to say that it was making Acknowledge weaker, but it wasn't. If even the dragons were finding it hard to prolong this fight, and they had admitted to them as such since they were trying to buy time for Igneel to appear, then they were still in a hell of a lot of trouble. Even with Acknowledge favoring the dragons as his targets over them, it still hurt when he did attack them, even if that attack was to knock them out of his way. Still, it wasn't like it didn't have benefits. Wendy was moving constantly around the sky, disappearing and reappearing somewhere else anytime Acknowledge got too close that she believed she wouldn't be able to react properly in time with everything else going on. But not once had Acknowledge even made a move on her since the dragons had showed up, and it was because of that which let her support all of them freely. Even now he could feel magic being poured into him from some outside source, replenishing the energy he had just spent and giving him extra to freely spend. It was like she was reading their minds, or maybe he was just that predictable right now. So he took all of the energy she had just given and began to shape it, storing it within his right arm and building it up until he was closer. He still doubted the attack would do too much, however. His legendary spell was strong, but against Acknowledge it didn't hold enough power to do its job. Acknowledge was able to overpower it too easily. Still, it had to hurt a bit if the dragon didn't even see it coming from his blind spot. And even if that failed, well, it would be a suitable distraction for someone else to leap in. Right before he could unleash his spell, however, pain erupted through his entire body, his magic slipping from his grasp as he turned back to normal and began to fall. He hastily struggled to regain any sense of control during freefall, his body flickering between the two states, before he crashed straight back down into the earth with a loud cry. Something had definitely broken. He had landed badly on his left arm and he completely expected to see it bent at an angle when he looked over at it. What greeted him instead was a far different sight. Scales, he muttered, not even confused at the fact his arm had somehow healed from its broken state. Ah. So now's the time, is it? My time as a human's over. The change wasn't as he expected. His skin felt like it was on fire. His muscles were growing and breaking, and then repairing and breaking again as his bones did the same. He had wondered what it would have felt like when the change finally began in full swing. And honestly, he could say it was not as painful as some of the things he had felt. Acknowledge had already put him through worse punishment. Compared to that, this pain was nothing. Even so, it was painful. But he didn't scream. Instead he roared out in defiance, trying to swallow the pain under an image of bravado. He half wondered if it was really a good idea though when Acknowledge froze mid-flight up in the sky. He knew what had caused that. What had caused Acknowledge to be slowly looking down at him, hesitating for a brief moment before the dragon had shot down a new path. One that led towards him. It was his roar. He had heard it change halfway through, becoming far more like that of a dragon's until the human traces of it disappeared. Acknowledge knew what that meant. Everyone did, he reckoned. He was changing. Becoming a dragon. And for Acknowledge, that must have filled the dragon with pure fury. And hopefully a bit of fear if he was being honest, but he doubted he was that lucky. Every poured off him as the change continued, even as Acknowledge got closer. Metallicana and Vicelage tried to block the dragon's path, going as far as to use their own presences as decoys to try and pull him away, but for once Acknowledge didn't care for them. The dragon's entire focus was on him and him alone, on stopping him from becoming a dragon. Even with all of Acknowledge's speed though, the dragon wouldn't be fast enough. The process was going by too quickly, the lightning being released by his growing magical power coating him and expanding out until all that could be seen was the outline of a massive beast. A dragon. I won't allow another of you to exist. Acknowledger roared, closing the last bit of distance and slicing straight through the neck outlined by the lightning. His claws met so little resistance, slicing from one side to the other in a single swing as Acknowledger sailed forward. But the fact no body appeared or no blood was spilt caused Acknowledger to hesitate as he landed beside the giant form of a dragon concealed by lightning. As a result, he wasn't ready when Laxus smashed straight into him as he dove out from within the lightning. Snarling, Acknowledger dug his feet into the ground to stop himself from being flung back any further before his eyes met Laxus's own. And then widened as he took in Laxus's state. I know, Laxus said, glancing down at his own form himself. It's odd. I don't understand it either. But I don't feel like I'm being forced to change any further. It's like this is the form I am meant to take. He had expected a lot of things to have happened when he changed. This was the last one he had ever expected. His left arm and legs now matched his arm, scales near his joints and the ends of the limbs while lightning coursed through the middle, acting as a connecting force between the two halves of each limb. His main body seemed to do the same, areas of his chest cut out where lightning sparked out from. He didn't have time to try it out but he could feel the lightning that coursed between his upper and lower halves of his body, and he knew if he wished he could extend them apart like with his arms and legs. Raising a clawed hand to his face, he let his fingers run across the texture for a moment, testing out the features curiously. So they settled. That's a relief, he muttered. He had looked quite disturbing in his half-changed state and he could tell from the feel his appearance had settled more on the dragon end. From what he could feel, it matched a similar shape to what he expected a dragon to have, if only on a smaller scale. He wished he could see his eyes. Looking out through them felt different than normal, so they must have changed in some way. Were they slitted like other dragons? At least he could tell the change his ears had taken. They had become far more pointed, and his hearing had already vastly improved. As had his sense of smell, in fact. It was astonishing how much his senses had improved. As a dragon slayer he had already been gifted with an enhanced sense of smell, but it had never been this strong. With this kind of sense, it was no wonder Acknowledger had been able to track them down so easily by them just exposing themselves outside of the barrier. He could smell things miles away, even if they were unfamiliar to him. What felt the oddest to him were his wings. He carefully watched Acknowledger, but the dragon wasn't making any moves yet, too lost in shock. A single attack would snap him out of it, so he didn't dare take that chance. The others were probably following his lead too, giving him time to become accustomed to his change. Moving his wings forward slightly, he managed to pick up their texture briefly. They were quite jagged at areas and he could see the streams of lightning escaping the lower edges and the sides. Just from reaching an arm back he could even feel the lightning present from his back, connecting the wings to him like his arms and legs. This is odd, he muttered to himself. I thought I gave up my humanity, and yet it appears I still took this form. He didn't feel like he was going to change again. That feeling had vanished with this form's appearance, his magic finally stabilizing now that it was no longer constantly trying to convert his body and soul. His magical power felt like it had grown in leaps and bounds, so much so that it was hard to even see its end. Why had he gained so much if he had only taken on this form? Compression. He muttered. Perhaps. This is more like your human form, he mused towards Acknowledger. Except somewhere in between. All the advantages of the shape, without the false image of a lost form. You dare. Acknowledger roared, charging in at him. Throughout this entire fight, he had fallen so many times and been rendered useless time after time. His speed couldn't match up. His power failed to inflict the blow necessary. Acknowledger had played with him. But for the first time since the battle had begun, he didn't feel so worried. Acknowledger was fast. But he knew in that moment that he could be even faster. A single step, a flash of magic, and his form shifted. Acknowledger reacted far faster than he reckoned most could have, and it left him with only small cuts along his scales from the lightning. But the dragon's fury said it all, directed towards him, standing halfway between where the two of them had stood originally, with his fist still held out in the air ahead of him. He was fast. faster than he had ever thought he could be. His speed had always come from his lightning form, from shifting back and forth when needed. But this body, it changed things. Only half of him really even had a physical presence. The rest was lightning, something that felt like a natural part of him. Before switching between the two had been a far more forced choice, but this felt natural. Like it was the way his body should work, and with less physical pieces to convert it took even less time. Striking just then felt easier too. He hadn't even needed to completely switch back to make that hit. Only his right fist had reverted. Could he do that for the rest of his body selectively? Wasn't that his default state anyway? It would take a bit of getting used to though. The faster he could react, the less of a lag there would be for his strikes. Though he was sure he had aimed a bit lower against Acknowledge to try and slip under his guard. How had he missed like that? And why was Acknowledge smaller than he remembered? He frowned, his eyes flickering down to the ground before back up to Acknowledge. He was taller. He had missed it before, but he was certainly taller. He wasn't even close to a dragon's height, but he had to be close to 1.5 times taller than before. His reach felt longer too. He'd have to try and adapt to that in his strikes, else he'd end up missing too much. All right then, he muttered to himself, lightning sparking off around him as he felt himself smirk from anticipation. Even though the situation was dangerous, he couldn't help but want to test these newfound limits. Guess he wasn't so different at times like this from some knucklehead mages. Shall we commence round 2? Acknowledge merely growled at him, charging forward in the blink of an eye. He didn't try and press his luck in a straightforward attack this time, knowing Acknowledge be waiting for it. Instead he leapt up, flying up at full speed until he reached the clouds. Alright, bit too high. Wasn't aiming for that. He had even greater physical strength than he thought, if this was any indication. Still, as he spun round and let his wings carry his weight in the air, he saw Acknowledge quickly leaping up after him. It definitely appeared that in a straightforward contest of speed that he had gained the advantage. However, if Acknowledge was this close behind, it meant the advantage wasn't overwhelming. What about strength? He darted down head on, pushing himself as fast as he could and swinging his fist forward into Acknowledge's own. He realized immediately that it was a mistake as he felt his arm shake, pain flaring from the blow, but he hadn't been flung away. So long as he struck head on, he wasn't going to be flung away. That thought lasted for a full second before he tried to block Acknowledge's second fist with the same maneuver and found himself getting flung back. Before Acknowledge could take advantage any further, he was darting upwards, outpacing the dragon as he soared up higher into the sky. Alright, so he knew now not to try that again. He was a lot stronger physically, but it wasn't on the same level as Acknowledge. His speed, however, seemed to be holding out though, so he could count on that. That only left one more thing to check. Was Acknowledge still giving chase? He glanced behind him before spinning round, facing the dragon head on as he raised an arm. Magic gathered from within at his call, the lightning around his arm intensifying. But the feeling, it felt off. And was that Wendy or Grandini causing that wind? Were they planning something? He quickly shook those thoughts away as he focused on his magic. Acknowledge was close enough, and if his lightning fly as fast as he wanted, then this should be fast enough to hit him before he realized. So with one swift movement he brought his arm down, the lightning being unleashed at its waiting foe. He hadn't expected the winds to follow the lightning, nor at how fast the strike actually moved it. Acknowledge looked just as surprised before barely getting an arm up in time, the blow slamming against him and unleashing a storm of lightning. Within moments Acknowledge was pushing through it, but he could see something he had been sorely missing in his previous clashes. Damage. Acknowledge's scales on his arm were cracked from that single strike. His magic was working. Preparing to go on the run and look for another chance to strike again, he was quickly reminded that he wasn't alone when rays of light was fired across the sky at Acknowledge, forcing the dragon's attention to shift and notice the massive iron dragon a moment away from ramming into him. The impact had Acknowledge flying far, with another blast of magic shooting across the sky from Sting and another that followed from God Serena. Now you are fascinating, came the voice of Grandini, the dragon slowly coming to rest beside him in the sky. Quite fascinating indeed. Is this form you're doing? He had to ask, because the look she had on her face was just telling him that she knew something. Did you do some kind of sky magic thing? None of the sort, Grandini admitted. If any of us had been aware of, well, this, then we would have tried it a long time ago. You are truly an unexpected creature, one we did not plan for. We honestly did not expect for there to be any dragon slayers beyond Wendy and the others. To think artificial ones would be made after our deaths. Then what's with that look? Because from what I have seen, I can understand what this is, Grandini stated. I saw the situation through my daughter's eyes. Tell me, did you assume that wind belonged to one of us just then? He frowned before realization hit in. She gave me some of her Sky Dragon Slayer magic. But I don't remember activating some kind of dual element mode. You probably didn't, Grandini offered as a suggestion. Seeing what you were, you looked incomplete. Half stuck as human, half stuck as dragon, with your body trying to switch from one to the other. The presence of Wendy's Sky Dragon Slayer magic helped speed up the process, but there was a variable she didn't account for. Not that I can blame her. She didn't even know about it herself. And that is? He asked quickly. Grandini smiled at him patiently. The antibodies I created in her magic. All of us dragons did this with our chosen child, preventing them from becoming like Acnologia and turning into a dragon. There shouldn't have been another case, but then you managed to transition between a second-generation dragon slayer to a first-generation one. You began to suffer the same that the dragon slayers of old did, and by the time Wendy introduced the antibodies through her transfer of magic, it was far too late to stop the process. Your body was too unstable, with your magic trying to force you into a new form. Of course, when it tried that, you became this, Grandini added. My best guess is that the antibodies helped stabilize you as the change kicked in at full force. It's why your form hasn't grown too much even though your body had changed. It's also why the magic you just used held traces of wind in its usage. You aren't using lightning magic but storm magic or some kind of equivalent as your default state, since Wendy's magic was so crucial in stabilizing you. So rather than becoming a dragon, I only turned halfway before I became immune to the process. Is that it? I assume so, Grandini replied. It is rather fascinating, you see. There hasn't ever been a being like you. You aren't human anymore, but you aren't really a dragon either. You're something in between. A middle step if you would, or perhaps something different entirely. How do you feel? Fine. More than fine, in fact. Good. Then let us rejoin the others. I have already began to feel the heat being carried by the wind. The temperature hasn't risen enough yet for others to notice, which means Igneel has given me a signal to draw Acnologia's attention. Considering your new state, would you mind assisting me with this? What do you need? Just him distracted or locked in place for a brief moment or two, near there. He watched as she gestured towards a nearby space in the air above where he believed he had last seen Natsu. Can you do it? How long do you need him distracted for again? At most, a few seconds. It'll let Igneel have the chance to appear and strike. He frowned for a moment before an idea popped into his head. With how much stronger his magic felt with even a normal attack, he could barely imagine what his stronger ones could do. One in particular would be perfect to try out. Yeah, I can do it. Leave this to me. Protector of the fairies. Why was there more? Those thoughts echoed through his mind as he broke out of yet another attempt to contain him, dodging the strike of one of those accursed beasts as they tried to rip him apart with their claws or crush him within their jaws. He should have been excited. There were more dragons he could crush, more he could fight. But he had already killed some of these dragons. He had felt their bodies crumble beneath his claws, and felt their blood against his feet as he walked away from their corpses. So why were they still alive after that? He had killed them once before. He could do it again. But how many times would he have to do this? Would all the dragons he had killed before come back, one after the other? Would he be stuck in an endless cycle of slaughtering the beasts again and again? On one hand, he had found great joy from killing them. But, how could he ever even say he was getting close to his goal if there wasn't even an end in sight? This was meant to be his last battle, one he wanted to enjoy as much as possible, and then it would end. All the battles of before had always brought the end closer, had given him purpose and meaning. But if the battle was an endless one, could the end even be reached? But worse was the sight of that thing. He had thought he had understood what was happening. The thing's body had been undergoing the same thing all other dragon slayers of old had experienced. With every bit of magic used, the thing had lost a bit more of its humanity and obtained a bit more of the essence of a dragon. And when that energy reaches its peak, the change would erupt at once. The point of which it occurred varied. Some took on dragon traits all across their body in limited amounts, scales being the most common, but it was extremely rare to find cases like what that thing had experienced. The only explanation that he could come up with was that the individual had managed to keep such a grasp on their own identity as a human that they had tried the process into dragonifying in much more limited areas. What might have been a limited change to an arm became a full transformation, in exchange for it being focused only there. And as time passed it acted more like an encroaching force, morphing the rest of the body from that point rather than spreading out equally. Was that the reason for the state this thing was in? When the change had begun, he had thought he had been fast enough. And if it had been a real dragon, he would have been. But that thing wasn't a dragon, nor was it human either. The shape of a human, if slightly larger, coupled with a dragon's body, traits, and magic. It could only be considered as some kind of in-between state, one that shouldn't have existed based on all previous examples. And yet this thing had managed it. And it disgusted him. Was this meant to be mockery of some kind? By trying to cling to one's humanity while taking the full power of a dragon? Was this thing trying to say something to him? To sacrifice something and yet still trying to desperately cling to it? It would have been better to have just throw it away if this thing had the resolve to go this far. He wanted to tear that thing apart. Before it was so easy to do so. But it was fast. Fast enough to outrun him in a straight-up race, but not fast enough to leave him helpless. Its power was still lacking compared to his own, but that thing seemed to be aware of that too. He would recognize the sight of one trying to test their newfound limits a mile away, and the fact he was being used as a measuring stick was even more insulting. He'd teach that thing a lesson. But first he had to get rid of the pests. The appearance of the dragons had worked to give all of the dragon slayers a new burst of hope, their very presence inspiring them, and their raw power was an annoyance. It was harder to keep track of the others too when his eyes kept tracking the dragons. Logically he knew he should be trying harder to keep his eyes on individuals like the Ukin, and when they drew near it was easy to do so, but their small sizes in comparison to the dragons, coupled with his own hatred, made it hard to think clearly. Oh, how he wanted to just wipe them all out. A single breath attack could probably do it if he got high enough. But he still had enough sense to know not to try it with that girl hanging around somewhere. Very rarely he caught a glimpse of her and then she was gone, as if having sensed his glare and was quick to retreat. If he unleashed one of his breath attacks she could very easily send it back at him, and while it might not be as effective it would still hurt and be a waste of energy. There was the small hope that she couldn't reflect it, but after that display with Etherian it was best to assume she could. He let out a small growl as his body continued to ache. Etherian's impact still hurt. Despite how much energy he had managed to gain from it, it had still been a mere fraction of that great spell's power. But he couldn't let it show. To show weakness was to invite death. That was how it had always been. So he wouldn't show anything until they all were lying at his feet, helpless and begging for death. Glancing around carefully, he noticed the charge of that annoying pair of dragons. Metallicano was not particularly difficult to deal with, but it took a bit of effort to actually get through the dragon's armor, and Vicelija had begun learning that from watching. As both dragons approached, light erupted from all sides of the dragon as it became equivalent to a second sun to look at. The light was already being to blind his sole remaining eye, leaving him with only sound and smell to judge by. He smirked momentarily as he smelled smells he had already become familiar with, whipping out with his arm and unleashing a wave of magic out behind him against the fool who had decided a sneak attack was a good idea in his blinded state. Not being able to see a dragon could do wonders for his focus. His attention quickly returned ahead of him as he felt the shift in the air, the light beginning to dim thanks to the giant form of a dragon appearing in close proximity to him. It was painfully easy to move away from the last bit of light, his fist swinging up and slamming straight into the armored body and blowing a hole straight through it and revealing its hollow insides. Wait, hollow? This wasn't Metallicana. He cursed as he began to turn his body around, his arm coming up just in time to take the brunt of the blow as a large giant arm slammed against him and send him flying towards the ground. His wings quickly spread up mid-fall, beating rapidly to slow his descent as he began to pool magic into his claws. Before he even had time to launch an attack at the dragon, he had another attack coming from above, a massive pillar of ice being flung straight down through the sky towards him. It was moving far faster than it normally should have. Had that singing dragon enchanted the ice to give it enhanced properties? He should probably expect it to hit even harder than before. But something like this wasn't going to damage him, and they must also know that. Which meant this was only a distraction. With a loud roar, he pushed his magic through the air and shattered the whole thing before it could even reach him. And as he expected, he briefly caught the sight of the Dragon Slayer with magic similar to his jumping from shard to shard of the falling ice pillar, using each one as a platform to push himself forward faster than before. With the energy still built up around his claws, he brought them together and let the energy concentrate into an orb ahead of him. Predictable, he muttered, the energy being unleashed and wiping away all the ice left over. He saw the Dragon Slayer hastily bringing his arms up in front of him before he was suddenly ripped out of the space, as if the wind had grabbed a hold of him. The sound of song told him all he needed to know on who was responsible for that, and he was already planning retaliation until that thing appeared within his line of sight. He was taunting him, standing there in the air as his wings flapped. The thing even had the nerve to cross his arms, as if insinuating that he was getting bored waiting for him to act. Had that thing forgotten everything he had done so far? Of how he had outmatched them all? Fine then. He'd have to teach him personally once again. Magic roared to life around him as he snarled out challengingly, the only action taken by that thing being to unfold his arms and bring one out to his side. That was when that familiar spell took shape. It was hard to forget considering the amount of times this thing had tried to use it before, and its distinctive shape made it even easier to remember. A giant spear of lightning, at least 3 times larger than the one wielding it, with all that destructive power packed into the point. He had crushed it so many times currently. Each time it had been a bit stronger than the last, but it had still been unable to overcome his own power. But he would be a fool to dismiss it in the same way as before. The difference between the thing and how it was before was like night and day. This attack, it could actually be a threat. And so he had to react accordingly. He didn't just want to crush this attack though. He wanted to crush the thing's spirits, by making it look like his trump card was still ineffective. He doubted he could replicate the real thing. He didn't have time to learn how to maintain all the energy in that shape and keep it cycling, and it may very well even be a technique only possible with lightning. But he could at least make a mockery of it. Stretching out an arm, he merely allowed his energy to gather and take on a similar shape. Wasting energy was hardly an issue, he was overflowing with it, so he didn't bother worrying about containing the vast energy he was emitted and wasting from making this giant spear. He waited until it was the same length as his opponent's, and then he doubled it. Glancing at the construct, it was nowhere close to as impressive. It was barely in the shape of a spear, without any of the elegance he could see in the shape of his opponent's, and energy would leap off from its unstable form with each passing second, requiring more to be spent to replace the energy lost. But that hardly mattered when he could see a brief bit of doubt settle on the thing's face. Looking back at his opponent, he saw the spear was already in flight towards him. The power he could sense alone was clearly different from before, but it wouldn't be enough. His arm came back before flinging his own weapon up to meet the attack, the two colliding at their points and exploding in a blast of magical power so large that he had to use his wings to keep himself from being blown away from the resulting shockwave. As it began to clear, he could only imagine the look of shock or fear on that thing's face. What greeted him though was none of that. Instead he saw only arrogance, and he knew if he could see his own face then he'd see the shock he had been looking for there instead. In the moments he had been waiting, the thought of his opponent creating another of these spells had crossed his mind. But neither of them would have had perfect aim through such a dense field of magical power, and he had been confident in his ability to dodge a blind throw. What he hadn't expected was for this thing to go even further beyond that. Not one spear, not 2, not even 3. Instead there were dozens, all lined up and tilted so that they could rotate in one large circle around the thing's back. I should have known one could never do the job, the thing called out to him, annoyance in the thing's voice. Even with all this power, my legendary spell still isn't strong enough to overpower you. But I made you treat it seriously and counter it. Tell me. Can you do the same if I continue this assault? The thing slowly raised a hand towards him, and in that moment he was desperately trying to close the distance. If he let that thing fire those spears, even he wouldn't be able to shrug that off. Too slow, the thing said to him, and before he could even reach that thing all the spears separated from another and took aim at him before firing in a single barrage. He couldn't let a single one hit. The resulting explosion would be like a chain reaction, detonating the others. If he could just break through the barrage, he'd be fine. Except he was close. Too close. He could see now that the thing had baited him in, and each spear was aimed too precisely for him to merely slip through. That left only one solution to get out of this mess. The one that he always fell back on. Pure strength. With a loud roar, he fired magic straight up to meet the spears, funneling as much magic as he could quickly into the roar. Too weak and the spears would cut right through his attack. But there was no way his attack could be too weak. As he wanted, he felt the shockwaves of the spears exploding as their forms became destabilized by his own roar. Using that energy as a smoke screen, he let it hide his movements as he darted forward and prepared to rush right through the blast. The second he did, he reacted on pure instinct. Magic came to his aid, shaping into a hastily constructed spear like before until he abandoned all pretenses with the shape and just used it to swat the spear that had been about to impale him out of the way. The sight of that thing and the arrogant look on its face only made him anger, and if he could have he would have crossed the remaining distance and torn that look right of its face. But he couldn't do that. Not when more spears had already been fired upon him, and he could see more being made even now and held in that self-formed ring of spears. The thing didn't have the magical power for this. There was no way it did. And yet the thing was forming more spears with each passing moment, the current ones in creation only half finished. For the ones in flight, he didn't sense any weakness in them either, which meant they all carried the same strength. It wouldn't have been out of place for Manukin, but this thing was certainly not one of them. So where was all this magical power coming from? He barely had time to even try and come up with an answer, batting another spear out of the way and having to deal with the explosions coming too close for comfort. He couldn't avoid this entirely anymore, but he could at least prevent a direct hit. The rest would only sting if they were only catching him in their blasts. Except the closer he got, the tighter the net that thing was casting got. The spears fired closer to one another, forcing him to react faster and faster while trying to bat the most dangerous of the spears away. Until eventually he couldn't even do that. One hit and exploded against him, the shockwave sending him flying back. That was all the opening that thing needed to send the rest of the spears bombarding against him. His arm hurt from where the majority of the blast had gone off against, but he didn't have time to worry about it, raising his other arm quickly and expelling as much magic as possible before the bombardment of legendary spells hit him. His energy took the brunt of the blast, causing the spells to explode against it and lessen the damage. But it wasn't enough. He could feel lightning slamming against his body, tearing its way through every little crack it could and trying to tear him apart from the inside. If this kept up, he would die. So before it could, he summoned up his power and roared, forcing all magic around him to break apart and shatter. The legendary spells in flight became nothing more than sparks of lightning in the sky, and his own energy was parted in an instant. And for that brief moment, he saw that thing freeze up in shock of his spells shattering. That time was all he needed. Instantly he was rushing upwards, closing the gap before any more spears could be formed. In one swift move he would end the threat in an instant, even if the thing managed to recover in time. That was the plan at least. Until an old scent hit his nose, confusing him briefly at why he recognized it. And then he remembered that this wasn't the first familiar scent and knew immediately what it was, his head turning towards the source. He'd missed it. The massive amount of magical power fired down upon him had clouded his senses, and he was only realizing it now when faced with magical power that felt like it was trying to burn him where he stood. All he had time to do was raise his arm towards the giant dragon arm being swung at him before he saw scent flying, the flames that had been lit around it trying to burn his scales away. He'd recognize this heat anywhere. Only one dragon had this kind of heat. And had been dangerous with his flames, but they had been dangerous due to their properties, not their heat. But these were old flames. Flames that had proven their supremacy over all other flames and had burnt away any weaknesses it might have had. "So you survived too," he snarled, his eyes spotting the form of the large dragon in the distance easily. The Fire Dragon King. Igneel. Protector of the fairies. The Shattered Masks. "I have to say, you are looking well," Igneel commented. Despite his casual tone, however, his actions could not be any different. Flames would flare up across his body at the slightest movement from Acknowledge, and his muscles would tense ready to act at the first sign of danger. Too well, in fact. "I wasn't sure before, seeing it through my son's eyes, but you hardly seemed to have taken much damage beyond that eye of yours. That should speak more of the inferior lot you have chosen to ally yourself with. Even your own heir is weak. If it wasn't for his demonic existence, he would have perished countless times already. Well, it's not really fair when you've been singling him out so much. It's no wonder he's had to experience such painful injuries time and time again. You just don't know how to hold back, both in fighting and in motivation. Tell me, do you still hate us?" "Hate you?" A cold chuckle escaped from Acknowledge's throat, as if the very idea that Igneel was asking this was laughable. "You need to even ask? I should have thought I've made my views on your entire race clear from the very beginning." Smirking at the sight of flames increasing in intensity, Acknowledge brought a hand forward as if he was giving Igneel the right to proceed. "So why wait over there? You already knew the answer, and yet you wasted time anyway. Or are you waiting for someone? Another dragon perhaps?" For a moment Igneel's flames flickered out in shock. Acknowledge didn't miss that opportunity, closing the distance in a blink of an eye and slamming his fist towards the fire dragon. His own destructive magic met Igneel's own reigniting fiery brand as their fists met, but it was still Igneel that felt the full brunt of it and was sent back through the air. Rather than press his advantage, however, Acknowledge held his ground, instead looking around him at the figures that had surrounded him. "Let me see. A Nookin, a Shinigami, a demon, a hybrid, an anomaly, an abomination, and a pretender. 7 dragon slayers, all the strongest left of their kind. Alongside them, we have 4 half-dead dragons, burning through their souls for one last fight against the monster they ran from. Is this all of you?" "Yeah," Igneel growled out, shaking his fist slightly to try and get rid of the lingering pain from their previous clash. "That's all of us. No one else is hiding in the woodworks. We're all that's left. But we'll still enough." "No, I don't think you are," Acknowledge stated as he continued to glance around, treating Igneel's words as mere noise. 4 dragons from 4 dragon slayers. The Shinigami, the Ukin, and the Abomination don't house one. Their scents are too different. Even the Ukin, with 8 mixed scents, doesn't have the same overpowering one that those 4 housing you did. I should have recognized that scent. Should have realized they smelled too different to be normal dragon slayers, and this is why. But wasn't there another?" Acknowledge didn't bother hiding his smirk as he turned back towards Igneel finally, uttering a single name. "Skyadrum. How do you know that name?" Grandini asked from above, her usual kind tone replaced with pure viciousness. "You don't remember our names unless you believed we mattered in some regard. And to you, we only mattered if we were the strongest. Otherwise we were just another mark on your kill count." "She's right," Vislaja stated. "Skyadrum was my friend and my rival. But I doubt you remembered my name before today, if you had even heard of it. Skyadrum would have been the same. We were not strong enough to ever make you remember us. Not like Igneel could. Indeed. I won't pretend like I remember much. But I do remember this," Acknowledge added, his smile growing vicious as he let out a laugh. "I remember how it felt as I shoved my hand through his chest. I remember how he begged me to turn back as I crushes his heart with my magic. And I remember that look on his face as the life left his eyes. You are right. He was not strong. But he was a memorable kill, I can promise you that. You know where he is?" The voice that spoke was quiet, unable to be heard by most. But the spike in magical power was enough to draw Acknowledge's attention to the source, noticing the massive amount of power being released by the one with similar magic power to himself. "Oh? You look angry," he pointed out, enjoying the look on the Dragon Slayer's face. "In fact, I'd say you want to kill me for your own personal reasons, not out of some misguided sense of duty or some understandable desire of survival. However, I can hardly see why the death of that dragon matters to you. Your dragon still lives." "I couldn't find him," Sting muttered in fury, his voice raising with every word. "I looked. And looked. And looked. But I couldn't find him, no matter how hard I tried." "The dragon?" "No." Sting roared, rocketing towards Acknowledge and ignoring the warnings of the others as he charged in head first. "His son. And my friend." "Oh, I know who you are now," Acknowledge stated, a wild smile appearing on his face as his eyes shone with amusement. He quickly met Sting's charge head-on, catching a magic-coated fist with one hand and feeling the lethal power put behind it. "You're Sting Cliff." "Sting. Get away. Not a chance." Sting roared, bringing his other fist forward and slamming it against Acknowledge's face with all his strength. For a brief moment he felt it collide against something, Acknowledge's face literally darkening, before his magic was released in one large blast. Yet the grip on his hand didn't weaken in the slightest, Acknowledge's face slowly coming out of the magic without looking any worse for wear. "I can't believe I didn't notice it earlier. You were on Rogue's mind a lot." "You do know who I'm talking about," Sting snarled out, the anger he felt overwhelming the pain from his hand as Acknowledge tightened his grip. "You. What did you do to him?" "To Rogue?" Acknowledge laughed mockingly. "I kill dragons. What do you think happened to your precious friend?" "You bastard." Tearing his way out from Acknowledge's grip, he ignored the wounds it left across his hand as the claws tore across his flesh. He slammed it back forward without giving Acknowledge a chance to react. That was his goal, however, if not for the fact his fist was easily swatted to one side, the magic unleashed simply scraping past Acknowledge's ear. It didn't stop him though. As one fist came back, the other was launched forward. The same result met him again, but he wasn't thinking clearly enough to do anything else. Instead he simply threw his all into these simple punches, firing off magic with each blow as he rained them down on Acknowledge. With each hit he got faster, his failures motivating him further as he tried again and again and again to reach the source of his hatred. Until eventually Acknowledge was too slow for one blow, and his fist made contact and unleashed all its magic point blank. He still didn't stop though. It was like his mind had gone blank beyond anything but this feeling of rage. Blow after blow, he continued to rain them down upon Acknowledge without hesitation, to the point all the magic he had unleashed prevented him from even being able to see Acknowledge through it. And even then he didn't stop, not when he could feel his fists connecting with something. Then, out of nowhere from his perspective, he was flung away. He braced himself for pain only to realize quickly that it hadn't been Acknowledge that had sent him flying. Rather he was being dragged back through the air by Laxus, held tightly under the man's arm. "What the hell are you?" His words ground to a halt as he watched the area where Acknowledge had been standing and get hit from all sides. Fire was whipped into a frenzy by winds that engaged it and prevented it from escaping. Iron slammed in from two sides while reached up from below, and pure energy and light fell from above. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" Laxus roared at him, releasing his grip on him as they reached the ground and letting him drop into a heap. If Acknowledge had retaliated right then, he killed Rogue. "So that's a reason to throw your life away too, is it?" Laxus growled out, his eyes leaving the mage at his feet and focusing on the lingering magic that was slowly revealing Acknowledge's form again. "Not even a scratch. That's not right." Sting could hardly hear Laxus, his gaze locked on Acknowledge in fury. He was about to charge in once more when Laxus gripped his shoulder tightly, holding him in place. "Stop. Calm down." "I am calm." "That doesn't look like you'll calm to me." "Stop this before You shouldn't listen to him, Sting," Acknowledge called out, Laxus's words falling deaf to Sting at the sound of his enemy's words. "I don't fall easily. I don't wound easily. Considering you share my magic, I had expected you to be more dangerous than you were. Or do you not hate me enough to go in for the kill? Be quiet. Sting roared, taking a step forward before suddenly finding himself being flung back, Laxus pushing him out of the way and taking his place as Acknowledge shot towards them. The wind around the dragon slammed against him until he raised his hand forward, unleashing a blast of magic down against it and forcing the barrier out of his path. Knowing Sting was still behind him, Laxus quickly brought his arm up towards the blast heading towards them, lightning tearing forth through the sky and piercing the attack straight through the middle. It left him little time to react when Acknowledge took advantage of that to slip past his guard, and he barely managed to kick back off the ground and dart backwards before a fist slammed through the air where he had been. The pressure from the blow itself however pushed him back further than he intended to go, and by the time he blinked it was too late. Sting had rushed back ahead of him towards Acknowledge once more. Sting! Stop! Sting didn't listen, magic trailing behind his open fists before he brought them together right before Acknowledge, the shadows of one hand mixing with the light of the other. The two were unleashed in one massive blast, closing the small distance left towards Acknowledge and destroying the ground between the two of them. All Acknowledge did was hold up a hand and catch the attack against it, his own magic swelling in size and pushing back against the destructive storm. His attack wasn't enough. Sting knew it wasn't. So he didn't stop. He didn't even register when his reserves were replenished, nor when his body began to feel lighter as he darted around his own attack. His body shifted as light and tore right past Acknowledge, and as he returned to normal he wrapped thin beams of light and darkness around his fingers and slashed out with them at Acknowledge's exposed side. Before his attack could connect however, he saw the look on Acknowledge's face before the dragon's other arm came up and unleashed a wave of magic that swatted his own attack away before it could make contact. He didn't retreat though, even as the magic threatened to swallow him too. Instead he plucked up as much magic as he could quickly and shoved it all to his throat, unleashing the fastest breath attack he could. The massive amount of magic unleashed was enough to put his existing attacks to shame, easily overpowering Acknowledge's own attack and slamming straight into the dragon before him. Predictable, came an annoyed voice however, and with the sound of a deafening roar his entire attack was dispersed in all directions, Acknowledge standing there completely unaffected. How? Rogue would have used the same attacks. He has used the same attacks. Which is why they won't work against me. Damn you! He roared, launching a fist at the dragon only to have a hand snake out and grab him by the neck. Yes, Acknowledge muttered, holding Sting up with one hand as if examining an interesting item he had obtained. That's the right look to have. You hate me. The others here, many of them don't. They don't want me to win, they don't want me to kill anyone, and they certainly don't like me. But they don't hate me, or at least most of the dragon slayers don't. Because I had done little to them worth hating before today. You killed Rogue. And that is why you are so different. The dragons have a reason to hate me but they keep their anger in check. You don't, but you must be realizing it. The strength rage can bring you. I can tell you with great certainty how strong it can allow one to become, when they throw away everything for that sake of that single emotion. It's no wonder now why you are finally able to be a proper threat, Acknowledge added. You are finally starting to fight like me. Like you? I'm nothing like you. Oh really? Single-mindedly trying to kill me while ignoring everything else around you? Widen the scope of your anger and you'll find we are more similar than you'd think. It's like looking at a window to the past and seeing how my old self must have looked. Given time, you could become so strong. All pretense of amusement vanished through as Acknowledge suddenly struck out, slamming a fist through Sting's chest. You'd need 400 years at least to begin to come close. You won't get a single day more. Is that so? Sting muttered out before his body turned to shadows, shocking Acknowledge just long enough for him to reform and swing a fist out at him, catching the dragon off guard and pushing him back a step. It would have been simple for the dragon to close the gap once more, and as Acknowledge turned to him he threw that was about to happen. There was pure fury on the dragon's face, even as the flesh seemed to darken again to his surprise. But before he could even make note of it or before Acknowledge could move back in they both found a wave of ice, spreading across the battlefield and towering up into the sky, blocking their path. With the dragon out of his sight, he felt like he was calming down for the first time in a long while. He didn't even resist as he was dragged away by Laxus once more, keeping his eyes on the ice wall for the moment when Acknowledge would break through it. Well? Do you feel any better now? No. I'd be surprised if you did, Igneel stated as the fire dragon joined them both, Laxus shoving Sting onto the dragon's back to get him out of his hands. Acting out one's revenge rarely does bring about any form of long-lasting satisfaction. It doesn't do anything to rid yourself of that pain, and it tends to blind you to what should be most important. Speaking of most important things, where's Natsu? Laxus asked. You were hiding inside him, right? You know much about what's going on between him and E.N.D. Natsu is regrouping with Ziraf currently. So he's... Laxus paused for a moment, running over the words Igneel had just said. Wait, do you mean Natsu or E.N.D? I mean my son, though which he is doesn't quite matter anymore after the choice he made. But you should find him a lot more familiar to you all. Oh, thank God, Laxus muttered. That's some good news in all this chaos. Is he planning to jump in anytime soon though? He's waiting for my signal. Acknowledge expects a childlike attitude from him. He expects to be met on in a far more straightforward way, where the only difficulty is in predicting what he does. Natsu will only have one chance before Acknowledger realizes that all that dangerous energy is now being wielded by one who knows how to fight. The question right now is the timing for this, Igneel added. Acknowledger does not appear to be showing any form of weakness. We're well aware of that. How bad was he when you all fought him 400 years ago? More wounded than he is right now. Far more in fact. Some of us even hoped he would have succumbed to his wounds after the final battle on the day the war was ended by him. Which is why it strikes me as odd that he has yet to truly take any injuries beyond his eye so far, despite all you've thrown at him. You think something is up to her? More than that, Igneel muttered. I'm sure the other dragons have a faint idea too, but Acknowledge looks different. 400 years can change a person, and his dragon form has not changed a bit. But his human form. In many ways he seems different. His face darkened a bit in a few of the recent times I hit him, Sting said as he spoke up. You think maybe there's something up with his form? I didn't even know a dragon could take on a human form before learning of him. They can't, typically speaking, Igneel stated. But he was once human. Perhaps that is what allows him to shift. Physically he is still a dragon, despite how his form may appear, which is why your magic can still affect him. On a theoretical level it might be possible for him to change his own appearance too, having grown tired of how he used to look. 400 years can sometimes spark a desire for change, but coming from him, I don't think he would have the mentality to do so. Not for such a small reason such as that. Unless he wanted to hide something, Laxus muttered as a spark of inspiration hit him. Something he didn't want us to notice. Now that could very well be something he would do, Igneel agreed. He has grown arrogant, though not without cause. He is the undefeated. The invincible Acknowledger. Perhaps what Sting saw is what keeps up that illusion, hiding his true state so that none are ever the wiser. If that's the case, why am I the only one to notice? Sting demanded, growing anxious as the ice began to crack in one area, as if something had been slammed into it. Hasn't anyone else seen that occur? Maybe the strain of keeping up such an illusion has started to become too much under such pressure. Or maybe it is because it is affected by your own magic, so much so that it tricks itself into thinking it's the same energy when in fact it is a threat. There is, of course, only one way to test this. If you can swallow your anger for the time being, we will give you the opportunity you need. Then make sure you hit him without giving him any time to realize and blow that disguise away. If we can confirm his true state, we can determine where he is weak and focus down. Otherwise we'll be simply dancing to his tune until we run out of energy. Wendy won't be able to keep up her efforts forever. Protector of the Fairies. Sighing in frustration, Ziraf watched the clash of dragons and dragon slayers against Acknowledger only to watch their attacks continue to be rendered ineffective. Each strike was either deflected, overpowered, or hit and did nothing. Come on, he muttered, trying to look for any source of weakness. I know you're suffering. You took too many hits from END to be able to merely shrug them off like this. Where are you hiding your wounds? What hurts the most? He knew Acknowledge better than most. He knew the dragon was hiding them. Or at least that is what he made himself believe. He could only assume, and even if he was right, it didn't mean that the wounds Acknowledge had taken were actual serious. Still, anything would be helpful at this point. A hurt side might make Acknowledge subconsciously prioritize protecting it over the other. A weakened arm might result in Acknowledge favoring the other. The only thing he knew for certain from Acknowledge's condition was that he had one working eye, and that was likely only due to E.N.D's magic leaving too much of a mark before it could be hidden before it was spotted. Still, a slight loss of vision wasn't enough. Not yet at least. Ideas were constantly swimming through his mind, being considered, expanded on and discarded with each second that passed. With each movement Acknowledge made, he quickly combined the details he saw with the knowledge he had already built up, new ideas for demons being formed and old ones discarded as their usefulness ended. How many would it take? He muttered to himself, considering how many he would even need to draw Acknowledge's attention and take advantage of any weaknesses that he discovered. A lot at least, and their sheer numbers would require them to be replenished at a great rate with the damage Acknowledge could do with a single attack. He would have to use his Zanpakuta to create such numbers. Only the gate was a double-edged sword. To create the required number of demons, he would need to push it to its limit. That meant increasing its size tremendously, but also making it a far easier target for Acknowledge to destroy. In all likelihood he would get a single chance to unleash his demons before the gate was demolished. A one-shot deal, huh? None of these will work, he stated in annoyance, throwing away the new ideas popping up into his head and looking for more. He had long since run out of demons that he could consider from the ones he had made in the past and was now being forced to try and think up new ones on the fly. There were many he'd love to experiment with after this battle was over, but for now they were useless to him. Well, almost all of them were. There was one that interested him. One he knew would work for certain. But it would also end the fight if they couldn't defeat Acknowledge and the chance he would bring from it. He didn't want to use it, but if things stayed the way they were he might not get a choice. Zref. For a moment he could briefly forget Acknowledge at least, an honest smile coming to his face as he turned towards his brother. Ah, I was wondering what was taking you so long. Did your regeneration slow down at all? I guess that girl is reaching her limits too if she is slowing down. But you made it just in time. Gesturing over to himself, he waited until his brother joined him before pointing up at Acknowledge. For some reason his brother took his time to reach him, as if hesitating, but he quickly ignored those thoughts as Acknowledge made another move, catching Gajeel and Metallicana as they tried to rush him together and held them back by their heads with his hands. God Serena made a move from behind, a massive wave of magical power crashing down towards Acknowledge, but it was the other dragons that took the blow when Acknowledge threw them straight into it. He's still pretty tough. But your blows must have weakened him. I want you to try and bring down whatever he is using to hide his true state. Your flames should be more than enough to burn away whatever magic he is using for this. You mean he might be wounded? Natsu asked him, and he couldn't help but notice the odd tone he was speaking in. He sounded different. His mind was playing tricks on him. He was sure of it. He had been thinking off too many demons and it must have been more draining mentally on him than he had initially thought. Yes, he said, choosing to focus on answering his brother's question instead. The question is how much? Can you do it? Yeah. I'm just waiting for Igneal's signal. Igneal's? When did you? He could feel a thought click into place in his mind, gears spinning as he remembered the dragon's appearance and how the others had appeared. Did Igneal speak to you when he came out? He asked cautiously, traitorous thoughts screaming out in his mind that he desperately tried to crush. Whatever he said dash. I'm sorry. But I'm not him Zref. He let out a laugh at that, faking it as he turned towards his brother. He didn't need to see a mirror to know his eyes were probably shining with desperation right now. Very funny Natsu, he said as he reached out an arm towards his brother and rested it on his shoulder. Igneal must have told you some funny stories. But it's fine. You don't need them. You only dash. Need to listen to you, right? Natsu asked, his head tilted innocently. For a moment he thought he could see him. His younger brother. But the annoyed look that appeared on his brother's face quickly smashed those hopes. Or would you try and wipe my memories instead? Restore me back to that perfect memory you have on me. His hand was quickly shaken off and he made little attempts to place it back, still looking at Natsu in disbelief as if hoping this was some kind of nightmare. That's impossible. The Book of End should have, your memories should have. Natsu's gaze softened for a moment. I do remember Ziref. I remember everything you did for me back then. I remember vague images of parents I feel little for. I remember loneliness from every time you walked out that door, and the joy that followed hours later when you returned. I remember us playing in the forests, you leading the way as I clung to your back in excitement. And I remember the way you'd go weeks without eating during the winter, all to make sure I was fed even if it meant giving up your own tiny share. You remember. Then you dash. I remember more than that, Natsu said as he cut him off, much to his confusion as Natsu continued. I remember the times I was awakened from that book. I remember the times you brought me out to fight, as few as they were in those early days, and I remember the desperation I had to be useful to you and the joy I had every time I succeeded. You remember that? But that's not a memory from when I was human, right? Natsu asked knowingly. You wanted me perfect. To be the living memory of your precious younger brother. But he's dead. What really am I? Natsu asked quietly, but words on pages. I inhabit a body that has been remade from a master copy stored in a book, and you transcribed as much as you could about me into those pages. Perhaps you even did pull my original soul back. But I don't think we can know for certain. I could very well be a demon you made to resemble your brother in every way that mattered, and you ignored that because it was easier to believe you finally succeeded. No, I did succeed. I brought you back. Maybe, Natsu chuckled bitterly. But, well, we can't really prove it, can we? We can't even ask the original. Ziref froze, his gaze shifting away from Natsu briefly towards where he could still sense Levi hiding with the Book of End. What did you do? He muttered in horror. Don't tell me she dash. Levi did nothing, Natsu stated before he could even finish his words. I met that younger version of me. Regardless of whether he was real or not, I met him briefly with Igneal. And I had a choice. To return to how I was, or to let him continue. And, you chose. Natsu shrugged. Neither. I didn't like those options. So I became him. My younger self, I mean. We are both the same person, it's just that he is who I was years ago and I am who came after. More than that, I'm the one who was left to keep leaving. The choice was always up to me. Those memories were merely meant to make me think that the best choice was to let him retake control. I didn't want that, Natsu admitted. But I didn't want him to vanish too. His power was necessary, true, but those memories were real to me. I didn't want to throw them away. So I accepted him. I took them all in, memories and power. I guess I truly am END now. You took them. But no. No dash. The Book of End has probably already begun to change as a result, Natsu added, almost as an afterthought. Which is why I'm sorry. That younger brother of yours, he isn't going to come back. He's a part of me now, but I'm going to listen to my own heart. Even if he wants me to right now, I can't just be your puppet like he wished. Natsu took a step towards him and he found himself involuntarily taking a step back in fear. Even with those flames, he knew Natsu couldn't kill him. He should have nothing to fear. But it wasn't physical pain that he could see coming. It was something far worse, something he couldn't just heal from in seconds. Natsu paused briefly, glancing at him in concern that he knew was only there due to lingering memories. And then the man closed the short distance before he could do anything and pulled him into an embrace. I am sorry, Ziref, he heard the man whisper to him in what he was sure was meant to sound reassuring or caring. But to him it only sounded like another knife being thrust into his soul. Thanks to these memories, I consider you my brother. I can't forget how fond I once was of you in them. But after everything you've done, that isn't enough for me like it was for him. Especially not when you did so much of it for my sake. I don't want that. Breaking away, Natsu turned his back to him to face Acknowledge once more. Since I've seen these memories, I think I understand you better at least. Which is why I know you won't stay long after this battle ends, if we even survive it. But for what it's worth, even if I can never forgive you, you were a good brother. I wish you hadn't turned out how you did. Ziraf hardly heard those words as Natsu took off into the sky, still frozen where he stood. It couldn't be true. Those words Natsu said, there were lies. If he just went and checked the book of End, he was sure he would see the truth. Only that truth wasn't what he wanted. He could feel his connection to the book. He could tell from that alone that something was different. What he had thought static, constant, unchanging, had been altered at some point. He'd made a mistake. He'd assumed he can make everything about End perfectly. That he had ensured his brother's memory would have remained perfectly preserved until the day it was safe to bring him back, not as a demon but as a true living and breathing human. It was meant to be the happiest day of his life, the very thing that had kept him going. And now it was gone. That day would never come. The memory preserved was corrupted. Natsu of Fairy Tale would also be a part of his younger brother Natsu, would always exist within the book of End now. Except he only wanted the latter, and now even that was out of his reach. His precious younger brother could never return as he once was. The best he could ever hope for was a pale imitation, holding memories and some feelings but little else. Just another person that he could never trust. He found himself fiddling with the ring on his finger, the very ring he had obtained after searching desperately for a way to save his brother from his illness long ago, and found himself wanting to throw it into the dirt and scream to the heavens. All of this had been for nothing. Everything had amounted to the same thing it always had as a child. Once again, he was reminded of just how cruel the world was. This world is still cruel, Natsu, he muttered brokenly. I forgot just how cruel it could be. There's nothing left except for an eternity of pain. Pain without end. Why? Why did everything always end the same way? From the very beginning, people had hated him. People had rejected him. And now the one person he desired by his side more than anyone else in the world had done the same. This world is cruel. So I'll destroy it. Those were words he had muttered long ago. It had once been his resolve. To ensure the world would be remade so his brother could grow up safely in it. Now though, such a result didn't matter. He didn't care about what came after. It could all burn. Protector of the fairies. Circling Acknowledge, Sting kept himself on the move, watching for that opening promised to him. It was hard to resist the urge to jump in, even after having managed to calm down a bit. Acknowledge's mere precious was taunting him, making him want to lash out. But he couldn't. He'd lost himself again and become a liability, the last thing anyone wanted right now. So he waited, watching as beams of light shot forth from his father and barely missed Acknowledge. Sting. He was suddenly elsewhere, and it took a moment for him to reorientate himself to his new surroundings. He wasn't that far away from where he had been, but he was certainly much higher, and the air was a hell of a lot thinner. Is there a reason for this, Wendy? He asked impatiently. I'm watching for Igneal's signal dash. That will give Natsu his signal that will hide your approach. I know, Wendy said quickly. He took a moment to look at her, annoyed at being cut off, and froze. Wendy, are you? She didn't look good. It was no wonder she was up here, he realized. She wasn't staying away from Acknowledge because it was easier. It was because it was safer in her condition. Cracks stretched across all her exposed skin, but they were worse around her eyes and neck, stretching down under her dress towards her heart. Does it hurt? He asked softly, gesturing at his own eyes. She tilted her head at him briefly before raising a hand to pat the skin beneath her left eye. A bit, she muttered. It gets a bit hard to focus sometimes. I've seen the cracks elsewhere though. I'm not sure how long I can keep this going. Using Nirvana is exhausting. Memories of his energy recovering so suddenly appeared fresh in his mind, causing him to press his head into his hands in frustration at his own stupidity. You've been refilling our magic reserves. I'm an idiot for forgetting. It's fine. It's not. Sting exclaimed, his head shooting up and forcing himself to remember just how bad of a state she was in. How many times have you used Nirvana already? I don't know, Wendy admitted honestly, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. I've lost track a bit. I'm not even sure how much time has passed, to be honest. When I'm seeing things like this, time is weird. All right. How long can you keep going? I don't know, Wendy muttered. Not long. It was hard before. Grandini and the other dragons made it more difficult. They're losing so much magic so rapidly, and it's taking everything I can to keep them here. I know when they run out. She looked like she wanted to cry for a moment, but she quickly swallowed back her tears. Maybe a few more minutes at best. That's just wishful thinking really though. I know the moment I'm about to break that Nabara will cut off my connection to save my life, even if means giving up on everyone else. So not much time at all. What do you need from me? Be ready. We can't afford for you to miss. Don't just tear away Acknowledge's illusion. Actual hurt him. You can build up all the power you need here, and I'll teleport you and all of it the second Natsu launches his attack. You should be quick though. Ignil's making his move. He swore as he looked down towards the battle, a massive storm of flames being formed in the blink of an eye from Ignil and tearing its way across the sky. In return he saw Acknowledge summon forth a blast of magic so powerful it parted the flames with ease and tore across the dragon's side, causing a cry of pain to erupt from Ignil in turn. Natsu was already on the move. There was no way he'd be quiet at this sight, plus the signal must have been given. So even though he couldn't see Natsu yet, he acted as if he had. Magic formed in both hands, an orb in each hand made of light and darkness respectively. He let each half build, growing in strength as he saw the first speck of Natsu's attack. Flames burst to life in the distance, different from Ignil's own. Considering he had felt the heat from up here from Ignil's attack, he could tell there was a sheer difference between the two. But these flames were far more effective, and he saw Acknowledge turn his full attention to them and fire a blast even stronger than the one launched before. It was obvious what Acknowledge was trying to do. He was trying to overpower the flames were more magic than it could burn away. The thing was that it worked. Like a wave of water it submerged the flames entirely, rendering them nothing more than a mere annoyance. He appeared within the midst of all that energy, invisible to Acknowledge's senses. With his own magic so similar to Acknowledge's own, there was no way the dragon could have picked him up with such a dense amount of his own magical power, even with his own attack ready to strike. The energy around him hurt, but his wounds were healing, probably due to Wendy doing some kind of remote healing with Nirvana after dropping him into this mess. Well, he supposed he had to make it worth it. The two orbs in his hands came together, forming a single orb of the same size as he forced the energy to compress down further and to spin faster. This was an attack he and Rogue used to use together. It was fitting that Rogue be part of helping him finish this. Dragon Slayer's secret art, Holy Shadow Dragon's Flash Fang. The energy exploded forth without restraint, becoming a sea of power in an instant. It completely overwhelmed what remained of Acknowledge's own power, and he was witness to a brief moment in which Acknowledge looked at his attack in shock. And, for some reason, he thought he saw recognition there too. And then that sea of power slammed straight into the dragon. For a moment he was afraid it wouldn't work. Until he heard a roar. It wasn't like the ones of before, where Acknowledge forced the magic around him to part. This one was from pain. Despite knowing he shouldn't, he let a bit of hope well up inside him at that sound. Along with a lot of satisfaction. Hurting Acknowledge was good. It got them one step closer to killing him. To ending this once and for all. I know that hurt, he called out. You can't hide it, and my magic won't let you either. So why don't you show us what you really look like, Ackno? No. All his satisfaction, all of his anger, it all broke apart with the energy as it parted. He almost found himself wishing he had found Acknowledge unharmed right now. That would have been better than this. It would have always been better than this. How? He muttered, his words breaking up as he tried to utter them in pure despair. How can you be here? You dared to push me so far, a voice far too familiar said to him, spoken with a face he could never forget. Half of it was still that of Acknowledge, but even that part was being peeled away, a layer of shadows being pulled back and pulling away the face they had all come to associate with Acknowledge. Me? The Dragon King. He couldn't understand. He didn't want to. But his voice still spoke anyway, speaking the words his heart was screaming out as the face of his best friend appeared before him after so long. Why are you there, rogue? Protector of the fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.